Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome aboard the Drowsy Historian, where bedtime stories don't just tuck you in. They peel back the velvet curtain of the past to reveal lice, filth, and 100 things you'd rather not smell. Tonight, we're not travelling to battlefields or palace halls. We're stepping into boudoir, satin-draped prisons of perfume, where Victorian women perfected the art of smelling worse than you ever thought possible, and somehow called it elegance. This isn't about old soap or a lack of plumbing. This is about what society did when appearance became more sacred than truth. So fluff your pillow, brace your gag reflex, and prepare to be horrified by the scent of history itself. Chapter 1. Morning Vinegar and the Scent of Survival. Imagine waking up not to the splash of clean water or the scent of lavender soap, but to the sharp sting of vinegar burning gently into your cheekbones. That was the morning routine for many Victorian women. Not by accident, not by poverty, but by design. The act of washing your face with water, believe it or not, was considered dangerous. It might bring chills. It might upset the humours. It might, heaven forbid, get you wet. So instead, you reach for a folded cloth soaked in vinegar or rosewater, stiff and sour, resting atop your nightstand like some sainted relic of suffering. You dab it on your face carefully, avoiding the eyes. The sting? That's the good part. That's how you know it's working. It tightens the skin, burns the cheeks just enough to bring a flush, not from health but from irritation. Now pause a moment. Breathe in. That's not perfume you're smelling yet. That's the raw scent of a body that hasn't touched water in several days, maybe weeks. The layered clothes, the padded corsets, the multiple underskirts, they've been absorbing sweat like emotional trauma, silently, thoroughly, and without escape. Enter our first character, Clara. Not a duchess, not a street girl, just an average, corset-bound, mid-tier housewife in 1870s London. Clara is devout, proper, and painfully committed to the rituals of appearance. She hasn't seen her own shoulders bare since she was 16, nor washed her feet with soap this month. Her idea of a cleansing ritual involves a basin of cloudy water shared by the entire household and a sponge that smells like it lost a war. Her husband thinks she's beautiful. Of course he does. Society has trained him not to notice the scent of decay under the floral haze. That haze? It's coming next. Perfume bottles. Thick glass, intricately cut, and more expensive than actual soap. Sit proudly on her vanity. Clara reaches for one that smells of violets and industrial alcohol. She dabs it onto her neck, wrists, and then, in a display of holy dedication, combs the liquid into her hair. Because nothing masks lice quite like alcohol and florals. This is the Victorian version of drowning in deodorant without ever showering. And yet, no one blinked. In fact, it was encouraged. You see, Victorian Britain didn't fear dirt. They feared cold, damp, and visible pores. Clean water wasn't just suspect, it was dangerous, especially in cities where pipes ran close to sewage lines and rumours of cholera spread faster than the disease itself. Better to stay dry and smell tragic than to risk pneumonia. And besides, for women like Clara, to sweat openly or to talk of hygiene was immodest. It was vulgar. Here's the irony. In an age obsessed with civility, personal hygiene was treated like a criminal conspiracy. No one spoke of it. The rich had servants to dispose of stained undergarments. The poor had no choice but to wear them again. But everyone wore the mask of scented propriety. And that mask stank. Let's be clear, it's not that Victorians didn't have access to soap. They just didn't trust it. Or they couldn't afford it. Or they bought it once and decided the boiled animal fat smell was worse than their own. Commercial soap was gritty, rough, and often rancid. Washing with it was like scouring your body with disappointment. So vinegar it was. Vinegar and cologne. In fact, many women kept bottles of eau de cologne that contained over 80% alcohol, not to freshen up, but to cleanse delicate areas when bathing was out of the question. Can you imagine the sting? Imagine using vodka as mouthwash and aftershave in one go. That was Tuesday for Clara. Meanwhile, her hair was a separate battlefield. Styled into intricate braids or buns that took hours to assemble, it was not to be washed, lest it fall apart or, worse, smell like wet wool. So she powdered it, or oiled it, or let it ride out the grease storm like a true stoic. Hair combs, the kind that looked like miniature rakes, were used to drag perfume and lice equally across the scalp. Clara had one. It was ivory, and crawling. But let's not single her out. Her neighbours were no better. Across town, Mrs. Dandridge, a minor aristocrat and noted socialite, employed a full-time maid just to brush and perfume her wigs. Real hair was optional. Smelling human was not. This cultural preference for scent over substance wasn't just a quirk. It was a hierarchy. The rich could afford layered fragrances and lavender oils. The poor smelled like coal smoke and unwashed labour. And so smell became a class marker, a sensory caste system where cleanliness was simulated through currency, not effort. And herein lies the sarcasm of Victorian morality, outwardly obsessed with purity, inwardly swimming in filth. A society that feared ankles and armpits equally, that whispered about fallen women but said nothing of rising mould in the boudoir. Clara wasn't dirty by laziness, she was dirty by expectation. Washing daily was seen as indulgent. Airing out clothes instead of scrubbing them, that was resourceful. Powdering over sores, that was fashion. Even doctors didn't help. Some medical texts warned that washing the body too often, especially for women, could weaken the constitution. One even suggested that too much cleanliness could lead to melancholic disturbances. Imagine telling someone with lice, well, you wouldn't want to be too clean now, would you? The result? Generations of women who developed rashes, infections, and hair loss, and treated it as noble sacrifice. Clara, like many others, had patches along her scalp where hair no longer grew, but she never complained. That would be immodest. Her story isn't unique. It's the background scent of an entire empire. And as we close this segment, ask yourself, what's worse? The lack of hygiene or the silence that surrounded it? Because in Victorian England, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was next to dangerous. And even God probably held his nose. But it didn't stop with vinegar. That was merely the opening act of a far more pungent performance. Let's follow Clara again. It's 7:04 a.m. and she's already finished pressing a vinegar cloth to her cheeks and combing the alcohol-infused perfume into her hair. She hasn't spoken a word to her husband, who's also politely ignoring the growing scent cloud in the room. Not because he doesn't notice it, but because to mention body odour in Victorian England was considered less civilised than the odour itself. The windows remained shut, of course. London air was thick with soot, coal and horse manure. Opening the window was trading one form of misery for another. And besides, a proper lady shouldn't risk the chills. Not after the morning vinegar ritual which, if you believe 19th century pseudo-medical wisdom, left the skin spiritually porous. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about discipline. That's what cleanliness meant, not actual health, but the performance of restraint. Now Clara dresses, and if you thought the hygiene issues ended at the skin, let me introduce you to the concept of multi-layered decay. First goes the chemise, a simple white linen gown meant to absorb sweat directly off the skin. This, more than any other garment, is the true frontline soldier in the war against cleanliness. Except it never wins, because it's rarely washed. Washing was labour-intensive, expensive, and could damage delicate fabric. So Clara wears the same chemise for days, sometimes weeks, until it practically walks itself to the laundry basin. But even then, laundering often meant airing it out on the line and dabbing it with a vinegar-soaked cloth. Yes, vinegar again. It seems the entire era was powered by acetic acid and sheer denial. Over the chemise comes the corset, whalebone or steel-boned, tightly laced, pressing sweat into the chemise and organs into submission. Victorian women were praised for their posture, their grace, their delicate femininity. What they weren't praised for was their bruised ribs, shallow breaths, and permanently displaced intestines, because nobody asked. Add to that multiple petticoats, perhaps a bustle, a crinoline cage, and finally the gown itself, layers upon layers that created the hourglass silhouette. Beautiful, yes, but functionally, it was a mobile sauna. In summer, women regularly fainted, not from nerves, but from overheating. But fainting, conveniently, was also fashionable, a sign of gentility. So society applauded what was essentially heat exhaustion in lace. And here's the critical truth wrapped in lace and lavender. The more a woman conformed to the dress code, the more she suffered, and the more she was praised for it. Fashion didn't just reflect class, it demanded pain as proof. Clara knew this. Every woman did. But to complain was to risk being seen as low class, masculine, or worse, French. The irony? Men bathed more frequently than women. Public bathhouses, private bathing machines at the seaside, even sponge baths were more common for men. For women, water was dangerous. The female constitution, doctors claimed, was sensitive, easily unbalanced, and so women were kept dry, powdered, and perfumed into fragile decorum. Hygiene had become a gendered myth, one that smelled distinctly of failure. Meanwhile, the servants suffered doubly. They were the ones who carried the sweat-soaked dresses, who prepared the vinegar cloths, who emptied the chamber pots and pretended not to notice the stench. But they weren't immune to the standards they enforced. Even maidservants like Eliza, a 16-year-old in Clara's household, were expected to keep up appearances. Her pay barely covered soap. Her schedule allowed no time for bathing. And yet, if she arrived smelling of labour, she was scolded. So she did what many others did. Dabbed cheap perfume on her wrists, stuffed dried herbs under her sleeves, and hoped no one noticed the lice in her bonnet. By now, Clara is fully dressed. She hasn't touched water. She hasn't used a toothbrush. Because toothbrushes, when they were used at all, were often shared among family members. Let that settle in. A shared brush. One bristled artifact standing proudly in a dish by the wash basin, passed between parents, children, and guests like a wooden torch of gingivitis. Instead of toothpaste, she might use baking soda, crushed charcoal, or even salt. Aggressive and abrasive enough to ruin enamel in months. But hey, the temporary shine looked divine in candlelight. And this wasn't even a secret. Medical journals from the time occasionally hinted at the dangers of poor hygiene. Rashes, tooth loss, infections. But the advice was vague, buried beneath layers of euphemism and shame. One guide advised women to avoid frequent bathing lest it weaken the nerves. Another insisted too much water would chill the womb. Imagine fearing reproductive failure from a sponge bath. This culture of willful ignorance infected everything. If a dress smelled, it was aired out. If a scalp itched, it was braided tighter. If the body burned with rash, it was powdered until numb. Everyone smelled it, everyone knew, and no one said a word. Because to admit that the Empress stank was to ruin the illusion of empire itself. And so Clara descends the stairs, fully perfumed, meticulously dressed, a walking contradiction of refinement and rot. Her footsteps echo on the carpet. The house smells faintly of roses and something deeper, the scent of secrets and starch, of flesh held captive by fashion. She will attend tea. She will sit in drawing rooms. She will exchange pleasantries with other women who are just as pressed, powdered, and perfumed. They will smile. They will admire one another's gowns. And they will never, ever mention the smell. Because in the end, Victorian society didn't care how bad things were, only how good they looked. And Clara, she will do it all again tomorrow. Because survival, in her world, came not from soap and water, but from silence. Chapter 2. Perfume, Poverty, and the Illusion of Cleanliness. To understand Victorian hygiene, you need to understand its most sacred relic, the perfume bottle. Small, ornate, often made of cut glass or crystal, and filled not with elegance, but with denial. If vinegar was the morning ritual, perfume was the armour, a daily act of olfactory deception. And oh, what a deception it was. Perfume, in the Victorian world, wasn't just about smelling pleasant. It was a disguise, a social passport, and a silent confession that your body was betraying you beneath your corset. To wear perfume was to participate in a grand, unspoken agreement that no one would talk about the rot beneath the roses. It didn't matter what you smelled like naturally. What mattered was what you pretended to be. Let's return to Clara, our reluctant heroine. She has, by this point, completely embraced the ritual. Her dressing table is cluttered with bottles of varying strength: jasmine, violet, lavender, even the coveted imported rose oil that costs more than a week's wages for her maid. She uses them liberally, layering scents like wallpaper over mildew. But Clara's use of perfume isn't merely cosmetic, it's defensive. She knows that underneath her bodice lies a secret, one shared by most women in her class: the undeniable odour of an unwashed body wrapped in 10 pounds of fabric. Perfume allows her to exist in polite society without being exiled for the sin of sweat. She is, in essence, buying her right to be perceived as clean. And this is where the real absurdity begins. Because while Clara and her peers could afford French cologne and perfumed powders, their lower-class counterparts could not. Working-class women, seamstresses, servants, maids, were left with few options. No perfume, no oils, sometimes not even soap. What they had, instead, was shame. This created a sensory class divide so stark you could practically smell it. To be poor was to reek, not because of moral failure, but because you simply couldn't afford to mask reality. Body odour became a marker of poverty, and perfume, a badge of economic survival. Victorian society didn't just judge your smell, it used it to decide your worth. The upper classes strolled through parlours smelling of bergamot and bergamot-soaked servants. The poor smelled like coal smoke, labour and desperation, and society judged them all accordingly. Even worse, this olfactory hierarchy was reinforced by science, or what passed for it. Pseudo-scientific papers warned of the miasmas rising from the working classes, claiming their unwashed bodies could literally poison the air. Entire neighbourhoods were blamed for epidemics based on how they smelled. The rich weren't just cleaner, they were safer, holier, almost blessed. The poor? Contagious by default. And if you think this was limited to humans, think again. Victorian homes were filled with odour-absorbing items: pomanders, herb satchels, bowls of vinegar, dried citrus peels spiked with cloves. Bedrooms reeked of potpourri and panic. Parlours smelled like someone had tried to embalm a rotting sofa. Even furniture had its own perfume rituals. Armchairs were dusted with lavender powder. Curtains were misted with floral water. Entire rooms were designed to smell wealthy, regardless of what they concealed. And what they concealed, more often than not, was rot. Let's not forget the furniture was never properly cleaned. Upholstered chairs soaked in years of sweat, body oils and candle smoke. Carpets thick enough to hide crumbs, fleas and the occasional mouse corpse. Drapes that hadn't been laundered since the Crimean War. But throw enough perfume into the air and visitors might not notice the filth they were breathing, or they'd pretend not to. Which, in Victorian England, was basically the same thing. Even the air itself became an accessory. The layering of scents wasn't subtle, it was an assault. One contemporary account described entering a ballroom as stepping into a garden made entirely of corpses and roses. That's not poetry, that's trauma. Clara knew this. She attended such gatherings, and though her nose burned and her eyes watered, she said nothing. Complaining about the smell would mark you as ungrateful, or worse, unladylike. And Clara had been raised better than that. She simply took a shallow breath, smiled, and let the fragrance claw its way into her lungs. Even children were not spared. Girls as young as 10 were taught to dab perfume behind their ears. Boys received cologne with their first waistcoats. Hygiene became performance art, rehearsed, repetitive, and entirely detached from the body's actual needs. And then there were the powders. If perfume was the veil, powder was the mask. Applied liberally to the face, neck, chest, and underarms, it was meant to absorb moisture and cover blemishes. In reality, it formed a paste, a moist, rotting paste, that clung to the skin like mould on bread. But it looked matte in candlelight, and that was all that mattered. Critically, many of these powders were laced with lead or arsenic. Yes, literal poison. Women smeared their faces with heavy metals in pursuit of that desirable pale glow. Over time, the toxins built up. Skin cracked, hair fell out, teeth loosened, but the complexion remained flawless, at least for a little while. Society saw the glow and called it grace. It ignored the tremors, the rashes, the coughing fits. Those were private matters, and privacy, as we've established, was often a burial ground for truth. Let's take a quick breath here, because even in a sleep-friendly narration, there's something haunting about how determined an entire culture was to never, ever admit it stank. The Victorians built an empire on illusion. Their cities were filthy, but their front rooms sparkled. Their clothes were soiled, but their appearances immaculate. They wrote essays on morality while ignoring mould on the curtains and rot in their hair. It wasn't cleanliness that defined the era. It was the refusal to acknowledge filth. In the end, the perfume was never about pleasure. It was camouflage. It was a weapon wielded against the very idea of truth. Clara didn't wear it to smell good. She wore it to survive a world that would punish her for being real. Because in Victorian society, you didn't have to be clean. You just had to smell like you were. Let's return now to the dressing room. Not Clara's this time, but Eliza's, the 16-year-old maid who assists her. The air here is different. No rose oil, no cut glass bottles, no mahogany vanity, just a narrow washstand, a cracked mirror, and the clinging scent of effort. Eliza doesn't have perfumes. She doesn't have lace gloves. What she has is a ragged cloth dampened with old lavender water. Reused so many times, it now smells more like mildew than bloom. Still, she dabs it behind her ears, because even servants are expected to carry the illusion. Eliza knows the unspoken rule of Victorian society: your body is your betrayal. If it smells of labour, you are low. If it smells of luxury, even cheaply imitated, you might pass. So she borrows Clara's old powder puffs when no one's watching, not out of vanity, but out of survival. She's seen servants dismissed for less. But unlike Clara, Eliza doesn't have the luxury of illusion. Her hands are raw from lye soap, her nails stained from soot, her corset second-hand. The perfume she uses, a watery concoction bought from a street vendor, burns her skin when she sweats. And yet, every morning she applies it with trembling dignity, because smelling poor in a rich house is a risk no servant can take. This wasn't just Eliza's problem. This was systemic. A whole country built on a contradiction. Obsess over appearance. Ignore reality. Take the laundry process, for instance. Instead, gowns were aired out, on lines or brushed with vinegar solutions to remove the worst of the smell. Petticoats, the layers that soaked up the most sweat, were often ignored altogether. They weren't seen, so why bother? Out of sight, out of stench. But here's the critical flaw. Ignoring something doesn't make it disappear. The unwashed garments didn't just accumulate odour, they bred it. Insects found their way into folds. Lice laid eggs along seams. And yet, society praised the outward cleanliness of the upper class, as if the visible surface of a dress could absolve the sins beneath it. Dirt that couldn't be seen didn't matter. Filth that couldn't be spoken about might as well not exist. That mentality extended into everything. Ballrooms, for example, were temples of fragrance and denial. Imagine 200 people crammed into a room heated by gas lamps, moving in stiff dresses and wool suits, all of them marinated in layers of perfume and powder, and none of them bathed recently. Now imagine no one is allowed to say anything about the smell. That's not fiction. That's Saturday night in Victorian society. Contemporary letters and diaries mention fainting spells at balls, not from excitement or emotion, but from air so thick with human sweat and floral chemicals that it could stun a horse. But instead of questioning the hygiene, Victorians added more perfume. If a little wasn't working, surely drowning in it would do the trick. What a strange kind of faith that was, believing in perfume more than plumbing. Doctors, of course, offered advice, conflicting advice. Some encouraged soap and water, warning that poor hygiene caused disease. Others, however, claimed that frequent washing, especially for women, was dangerous. It could lead to hysteria, or fertility issues, or weakened nerves. The vagueness wasn't accidental. It allowed people to do what they were already doing, nothing, and feel righteous about it. Even those who could afford better were trapped in the illusion. Imported French soaps existed. rose-scented glycerin blocks, oils from Italy, tonics from Germany. But they were rare and expensive. More importantly, they were decorative. A perfumed soap in a carved dish was a status symbol, not a tool. It might sit untouched on a guest basin for months, admired but never used. Real washing, if done at all, happened with harsh homemade lye soap, the kind that left skin cracked and fingers blistered. This soap was often made from leftover animal fat and wood ash, boiled into greasy bricks that stank before and after use. It worked, technically, but using it felt more like punishment than cleanliness, which is probably why so many avoided it. And so, back to perfume they went. But what happens when scent becomes the only hygiene tool available? You stop noticing when things get worse, when powders start mixing with sweat, when perfumes turn sour under body heat, when the lice return again and again. The cover-up becomes the norm. The body becomes a problem to be silenced. And the silence, like a bad smell, lingers long after it should. Even intimacy wasn't spared. Many Victorian marriages were built on scentless touch. Husbands and wives who slept in separate rooms would mask themselves before coming together. A spritz behind the ear, powder on the chest, perhaps even a peppermint under the tongue. Not to freshen up, but to disguise, to pretend. Because smelling like yourself was no longer acceptable, it was considered a flaw. This level of disconnection, from the body, from the senses, from honesty, ran deep. And it wasn't just about women. Men too were caught in it, drenched in cologne, soaked in hair oil, chewing cloves to hide bad teeth. The difference? Men were forgiven when they faltered. Women were not. For Clara, a poorly timed scent, or lack thereof, could mean gossip. For Eliza, it could mean dismissal. Even children were introduced to the rituals early. Infant powders, scented oils, little bottles of floral water. They were trained, from birth, that smell was performance. That cleanliness was perception. That what mattered was not whether you were healthy, but whether you smelled respectable. And what is that really, if not the saddest joke of all? That a civilization so obsessed with advancement, industry, empire, could not bring itself to say, "We stink. Let's do something about it." Instead, it doubled down, built a culture around the silence, raised generations to endure the rot as long as it looked refined. By the time the 20th century rolled around, things began to change. Slowly. Indoor plumbing, better soaps, scientific hygiene. But the legacy remained. Even today, we inherit some of this. The idea that sweating is shameful, that scent equals cleanliness, that perfume fixes what only water can. The illusion lingers. Clara, long gone, would never see the change. Eliza, if lucky, might. But even then, they'd likely reach for the perfume bottle one last time. Not because it worked, but because it was all they ever knew. Chapter 3, The Prison Beneath the Petticoats. Before she's even fully awake, Clara feels it. The weight. Not of dread, not of existential crisis, but of her clothing. A physical pressure coiled around her torso, pressing against her ribs, her hips, her thighs, like she's been buried alive under layers of cotton and social expectation. Welcome to the underworld of Victorian fashion, quite literally. The petticoat, the chemise, the corset, the crinoline, the bustle, the dress, the shawl, the gloves, and, if it's winter, a few more layers on top. This was the daily uniform of a woman in respectable society, and calling it clothing feels generous. It was more like architecture. The chemise was the closest thing to underwear. A linen or cotton slip, worn next to the skin, tasked with absorbing the sweat that would otherwise soak directly into the corset and gown. Except it wasn't exactly washed often. And when it wasn't with the frequency you'd hoped for something pressed intimately to the skin every day. Clara wears hers until the underarms begin to stain, and even then, the priority isn't hygiene. It's fabric preservation. God forbid a washboard should damage lace. Over the chemise comes the corset, the steel-boned or whale-boned marvel that promised perfect posture, a narrow waist, and internal organ relocation at no extra charge. Laced by hand, often by Eliza, The corset squeezes Clara's ribs into submission, redistributing soft tissue like poorly packed luggage. She doesn't breathe, so much as sip the air through a straw. But she stands straight. And that's what matters. Breathing, as always, is optional. Appearances are not. But wait, we're only getting started. On top of the corset come multiple petticoats, often stiffened with starch or horsehair to hold their shape. In summer, they trap heat like a greenhouse. In winter, they cling to legs already swollen from poor circulation. Either way, they become moisture nets, soaking up sweat and oils without mercy and without reprieve. Then comes the crinoline, a wire or whalebone cage worn around the hips to create volume. Its stated purpose is fashion, but its real function seems to be spatial domination. A woman wearing a crinoline can't fit through doorways. She knocks over teacups and candle stands. In crowded rooms, she becomes a hazard. Beautiful, yes, but flammable. And they did catch fire. Numerous cases from the era recount women dying in spectacular bursts of crinoline-induced combustion, the result of brushing too close to a fireplace or gas lamp. One moment you're elegant, the next you're an inferno. Society, rather than rethinking this madness, simply recommended staying further from open flame, as if that were the only problem. Because under those layers, hidden beneath satin and embroidery, was a reality few dared acknowledge. These garments were disgusting. Sweat built up, skin festered, rashes bloomed like watercolors on thighs and backs. Parasites thrived. And still, nothing changed. Women like Clara were taught not to complain. Complaining was unladylike. Cleanliness was silent, and so was suffering. Even worse, these garments weren't designed with practicality in mind, not just in terms of temperature or movement, but in basic bodily functions. Want to relieve yourself in a public space? Good luck. There were no zippers, no elastic waistbands, no simple buttons. If Clara needed to visit the chamber pot, she had to navigate a labyrinth of fabric, often requiring assistance. Modesty required full coverage, but full coverage made even the most mundane human need a logistical nightmare. Now, let's talk hygiene, or the laughable approximation of it. The undergarments, especially the chemise and drawers, were in direct contact with the body, but washing them was expensive, laborious, and potentially damaging. So instead of cleaning, women relied on rituals, airing out garments, brushing off dirt, applying powder to absorb sweat. If the smell became too strong, another layer might be added to trap it in. In essence, women walked around inside their own scent tombs, beautifully wrapped and socially approved. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The lack of airflow caused fungal infections, sores, skin abrasions. Many women developed chronic skin conditions they attributed to sensitivity or nerves. In reality, it was the simple result of marinating in their own bodily waste under heavy, heat-trapping fabric. Still, the blame never fell on the fashion. It fell on the woman's constitution. She was weak, delicate, emotional, anything but suffocating under 3 layers of sweat-soaked linen. Even the wealthy, with their maids' silk gowns and perfumed gloves, weren't spared. In fact, their exposure was worse. The more elaborate the clothing, the less practical it became. While working-class women at least wore simplified versions of the same garments, upper-class women bore the full weight of tradition and trend. Clara, with her full crinoline and bustle, her embroidered bodice and kid-leather gloves, might look divine from across the room. But step closer, and the reality hits. Quite literally, the garments had weight, 10, 12, 15 pounds of it. Add to that the stress of tight lacing, the reduced lung capacity, the heat, and the inability to move freely, and you're left with a very elegant form of entrapment, a fashionable coffin. Critics of the time, of course, existed. Some medical professionals spoke out against corsets, linking them to fainting spells, digestive issues, even miscarriages. Reformists pushed for rational dress, a radical idea involving clothes that didn't threaten to kill you, but they were dismissed as hysterics or, worse, feminists. The public wasn't ready to admit that its concept of beauty was actively harmful, and so silence reigned. And beneath that silence, moisture, heat, mould, the slow decay of skin wrapped in social expectation. Eliza, for all her simplicity, was luckier in some ways. Her clothing was lighter, functional, cotton perhaps, or coarse linen. No crinoline, no bustle. But even she suffered. Her single set of undergarments, rarely washed, became a breeding ground for infections. She had no time to air them out, no perfume to disguise them, just powder and hope. And when infections set in, rashes, blisters, lesions, she was expected to ignore them. "Don't scratch," Clara once scolded her, upon noticing her reach toward her waistband. "It looks unclean." Unclean. As if the problem were appearance, not the system. As if cleanliness were a performance. One Eliza failed at by being too visibly human. And that's the real story of Victorian dress. Not the glamour, not the silhouette, but the reality beneath it. Women suffering silently, trapped in their own garments, punished for their bodies, and praised for pretending it didn't hurt. Because in the Victorian era, your value wasn't tied to your health. It was tied to how gracefully you hid the damage. Clara stands in the hallway, layered and laced, ready to descend the staircase with the grace expected of her station. What no one sees, what no one is allowed to speak of, is that with each step her thighs chafe against damp fabric. Her skin itches, not from irritation alone, but from what's been festering beneath her petticoats for days. But she doesn't scratch, she doesn't mention it. A proper woman never draws attention to discomfort, even if she's practically rotting inside a dress worth more than her cook earns in a month. She walks like a statue in motion, fluid, practiced, and composed. Not because it's comfortable, but because it has to be. Victorian fashion didn't just confine the body, it policed the performance of the body. The ideal woman didn't move too fast, didn't slouch, didn't fidget. Clothing made sure of that. Corsets forced posture. Petticoats restricted stride. Crinolines demanded distance between people, especially between women, and anything resembling ease. And it wasn't just etiquette. These restrictions had consequences. Women fell, often, tripping over skirts, catching shoes in petticoat hems, misjudging the breadth of their own circumference. A quick turn in a narrow corridor became a strategy session. Public transportation was a nightmare. Sitting was a production. Clara's every gesture had to be calculated, because the very fabric she wore was out to embarrass her. Now, imagine living in this constriction every day. The body under those clothes was not respected. It was managed, hidden, muffled beneath layers of starch and expectation. If it bled, especially once a month, it did so silently. Sanitary products, if used, were crude. Cloth rags, often reused, poorly washed, or hidden in shame. Disposable products didn't exist. Open discussion certainly didn't. Women like Clara learned early on to suffer discreetly. A faint smile, a pinched waist, a bloodstain quickly covered with another layer of fabric. Eliza, meanwhile, dealt with her own version of this textile prison. Her uniform was lighter, yes, more breathable, but still unforgiving. She had one chemise, one, no rotation, no drawer of spares. And when it got too filthy to bear, she'd scrub it at night in freezing water with soap so harsh it left burns. Then dry it by the hearth and pray it was wearable by morning. She had no bustle, no crinoline, just the constant knowledge that if she stank, she could be replaced. Now step into the summer months. London's air, already thick with coal smoke, becomes heavy with humidity. The house traps the heat. There's no electric fan, no ceiling ventilation. Clara sweats, though she pretends not to. Eliza, lifting pots and cleaning fire grates, sweats openly, but must remain silent about it. Both women stew in their own garments, reabsorbing what their bodies have tried to expel. The petticoats beneath Clara's dress begin to stick to her legs. The boning of her corset digs in deeper. The chemise beneath it all now has rings of salt at the underarms, salt from her own body. But still, she powders her face and presses perfume into her gloves, because that is how one behaves. Victorian society was a masterclass in contradiction. It praised femininity, softness, modesty, yet demanded clothing that was militaristically structured. It scorned open discussions of the body, even as it manipulated and displayed that body with aggressive precision. It warned women against vanity, while simultaneously insisting they remain decorative. And yet, the system worked. Not because it was logical, but because it was unchallenged. Even medical professionals bowed to fashion. Some doctors denounced the corset as a health hazard. They cited case after case of deformed ribs, displaced organs, collapsed lungs. Autopsies revealed stomachs shoved upward, livers pushed aside. But society preferred the silhouette. So other doctors, better paid, more socially aligned, wrote rebuttals. They said the corset encouraged good posture, that fainting spells were a sign of delicacy, not damage, that a tiny waist was a woman's crowning glory. It was science wrapped in flattery, and people believed it. But the truth couldn't be buried forever. Servants like Eliza saw what fashion did up close. They washed the undergarments soaked in blood. They aired out corsets reeking of infection. They saw boils that burst beneath the waistline, skin turned black from rot, shoulders bruised from straps that dug in. But what could they say? Their job was to assist, not critique. So they held their tongues and boiled the linens. Meanwhile, Clara, who had no real alternative, did what all women did. She endured, not with pride, but with inertia. Because to question the system was to question everything, her upbringing, her worth, her femininity. What began as fabric became identity. What chafed became sacred. Still, there were cracks in the corseted facade. Feminist writers, early ones, uninvited to dinner parties, began to challenge the madness. They published pamphlets. They drew satirical cartoons of women tied into their dresses by male society. They mocked fashion as self-inflicted torture, but they were labelled radicals. The Rational Dress Society, formed in the 1880s, was seen as quaint at best, scandalous at worst. Imagine suggesting that women wear pants, or God forbid, walk more than 100 feet without collapsing. It was absurd. And yet, change crept in. The end of the century saw whispers of reform. Corset laces loosened, petticoats thinned, chemises were made from softer cotton. But perfume sales remained high. Powder still caked cheeks. Women still bathed in denial before they bathed in water. The dress softened, but the mindset didn't. Clara, aging into the twilight of Queen Victoria's reign, still holds on to her silhouette. She knows it's ridiculous. Her back aches, her feet swell. But when she looks in the mirror, she sees order, structure, purpose. The straight spine and narrow waist reassure her. They tell her she belongs. Eliza, now in her 30s, still washes her only chemise in secret, but she no longer thinks it's normal. She watches younger girls come into service with questions. She answers them, quietly, carefully, with truth. It's not revolution, but it's resistance, because that's how systems die, not with rage, with whisper. In the end, the prison beneath the petticoats was never just about clothing. It was about control, about teaching women that pain was decorum, that silence was grace, that discomfort meant dignity. And perhaps the cruelest part? They made it look beautiful. Chapter 4, Hairpins, Lice, and the Braided Biohazard. Clara sits before her mirror, arms folded neatly in her lap, eyes watching her own reflection like a woman awaiting judgment. Behind her, Eliza readies the tools of daily transformation, a bone-handled brush, a vial of rose water, and a tin of powder that smells vaguely of lavender and denial. It's hairdressing time, which in the Victorian world was not just a chore. It was a ritual, a discipline, a war with no clean victories. To the untrained eye, Clara's hair looks immaculate, a complex braid woven into a bun, pinned at just the right angle, with no strand daring to break formation. What's unseen is the truth, that this hair hasn't been washed in over a week, possibly longer, that beneath the coiled perfection lies a scalp that itches in silence, and that the pins, those elegant little daggers, aren't just holding the style together, they're holding in the bugs. Lice, you see, were not rare visitors to Victorian scalps. They were long-term tenants. In an age when full-body baths were rare and shampoo as we know it didn't exist, the human head became a breeding ground, a jungle, a sweat-laden playground for insects with no natural predators. Victorian women didn't wash their hair often, not because they didn't want to, but because they were told not to. Doctors warned that frequent washing could weaken the hair, that water could chill the brain, that women's scalps were too delicate for such disruption. And so, instead of cleaning it, they styled it, over and over. Braids were the preferred method of control. Hair was divided, twisted, wrapped, and pinned, not just for beauty, but for containment. Once styled, it wasn't undone for several days, sometimes longer. Sleeping with hair pinned up was standard. Clara never went to bed with loose locks. Instead, she wrapped her head in a cloth to preserve the bun's integrity, to keep up the appearance that everything was under control. It wasn't, because beneath the wrap, heat gathered. Sweat soaked into the roots, and lice, thrilled by the sauna conditions, laid their eggs, tiny white nets that clung to individual strands like stubborn pearls. Clara knew this. Every woman did. But acknowledging it meant admitting failure, so she pretended not to notice. She powdered her scalp and dabbed her hairline with perfume. If it itched, she pressed a gloved hand to her temple, as if in thought, and scratched through the fabric. Denial had become part of the grooming process. Eliza, of course, dealt with the infestation more directly. She brushed out Clara's hair daily, combing from root to tip with a fine-toothed comb meant to capture stray hairs, and yes, the occasional bug. The comb itself, often made of ivory or tortoiseshell, was rinsed in rosewater and set back on the vanity like a sacred tool. It wasn't sanitized, it wasn't boiled, it was just wiped clean and reused. Every single day. Now let's talk hygiene. Victorian hair products were a charming mix of the absurd and the hazardous. Oils made from beef marrow or bear fat were popular, applied generously to keep hair shiny and manageable. Unfortunately, these same oils also made hair sticky, heavy, and deliciously attractive to dust and insects. Powdered dry shampoos existed too, but they were usually made from starch, crushed herbs, or talc. Applied liberally, they caked onto the scalp, mixing with oils, forming something like paste. The result? A head that looked powdered and polished but felt and smelled like yesterday's porridge. And the tools? Brushes were often shared between sisters, sometimes even across entire households. It wasn't uncommon for one hairbrush to be used by 4 or 5 people, stored on a shared dresser, cleaned only when visibly gummed with residue. Combs, likewise, travelled freely between heads. Lice, naturally, made the journey with ease. But still, no one spoke of infestation. To have lice was a private shame, even though it was practically universal. Children had them, adults had them, servants and aristocrats alike. It was treated not as a medical issue, but a moral failing. If you had lice, it meant you weren't trying hard enough. Which is curious, given that trying too hard, i.e. washing your hair, was considered suspect. The contradiction never bothered the Victorians. They had perfume, because when things got truly unbearable, when the itching became too intense, when the powder turned to sludge, when the scalp began to burn from its own secret ecosystem, there was always the fallback. Douse it in cologne and carry on. Of course, this wasn't a solution. Alcohol-based perfumes stung like fire when applied to irritated skin. But the sting was framed as purification. If it hurt, it must be working. Clara bore the sting like a saint. Eliza, behind her, pretended not to wince on her behalf. Even treatments, when available, were suspect. One popular method for lice control was kerosene. Yes, the same fluid used in lamps. Women soaked combs in it, then dragged them through their hair. Some even applied it directly to the scalp. The theory was that it would kill the bugs. And it did. Unfortunately, it also burned the skin. In some cases, it even caught fire. There are actual accounts of women lighting their own heads by accident. But again, if it worked, it was worth it. That was the Victorian motto: beauty through discomfort, cleanliness through camouflage, health through silence. Meanwhile, the hair itself suffered. Repeated pinning, braiding and combing caused breakage. Patches of hair thinned or disappeared altogether. Women developed bald spots hidden by clever styling or hats. Clara had a patch at her temple that never quite recovered. It was blamed on stress. on tight bonnets, on everything but what it actually was. Self-inflicted damage in the name of decency. And this wasn't just about vanity. Hair was identity. A woman's crowning glory, quite literally. Thick, long hair was a sign of fertility, of virtue, of social standing. To lose it was to lose face. To have bugs in it was unthinkable. But rather than address the issue with something radical, like regular washing, Victorian society insisted on control. It wasn't about being clean. It was about appearing managed. And perhaps most absurd of all, the same society that turned women's heads into insect hotels expected them to decorate them like birthday cakes. Ribbons, feathers, flowers, even miniature hats perched atop powdered nests of hair secured with yet more pins. The outer beauty was ornamental. The inner scalp was screaming. Clara doesn't scream. She doesn't flinch. She nods politely as Eliza finishes pinning her hair for the day. The perfume bottle is placed gently back onto the vanity. The brush is wiped once, twice, and returned to its spot. The nits caught in its teeth are ignored, as always, because in Victorian society the bugs weren't the real problem. Talking about them was, if you looked at a Victorian woman from across the room, her hair sculpted into a towering chignon, not a strand out of place, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a marvel of personal grooming. But move closer and you might hear it. The soft rustle, the subtle shift of something alive beneath the coils. You wouldn't say a word, of course. That would be uncouth. You'd simply smile, nod, and marvel at the volume of her hairstyle, never questioning the source of its movement. Because in the Victorian world, silence wasn't golden, it was required. Behind that silence, women waged daily war against a world that expected them to be ornamental and odorless, composed and compliant, even as they itched, burned, and bled beneath wigs and hairnets. By now, Clara's head is swaddled in perfume, soaked braids, fastened tight with a dozen pins that feel more surgical than decorative. But this wasn't just about appearance, it was architecture. Hairstyles were structures, sometimes taking hours to complete, often done not by the woman herself, but by someone like Eliza. And if Clara moved too suddenly or rested the wrong way, the entire construct might collapse, pins and dignity scattering across the parlour floor. Naturally, these styles had to last. A woman might go 5 to 10 days, sometimes more, without taking down her hair. Unpinning, combing, washing, drying, restyling, it simply wasn't feasible, especially without running water, without hot baths, and with the constant threat that your hair, your social capital, could be ruined by dampness, breakage, or the horrific crime of looking human. So the hair stayed up, slept in, suffered in, and what grew beneath it was as unglamorous as you might expect. Scalp fungus, known then as scald head, spread easily among families who shared brushes and pillows. Dandruff was the least of their problems. Sores and open wounds festered beneath perfectly arranged curls, made worse by powders meant to absorb oils, but which instead formed a gritty crust. Still, the hair was powdered again the next day. The parasites didn't mind. Let's pause here to consider just how deeply Victorian women were indoctrinated into accepting filth, so long as it looked fashionable. They had the means to remove lice. Combs existed. Boiling water existed. So did rudimentary shampoos made from herbs or soapwort. But these methods required taking hair down, getting wet, and undoing the fragile illusion of refinement. And that, for many, was unthinkable. Because once you'd been trained to believe that discomfort was noble, hygiene became vanity. Cleanliness became a threat. And bugs? Bugs were just part of the bargain. Children weren't exempt. Little girls were taught early that beauty required patience. They sat on stools as mothers raked combs through snarled, perfumed nests of hair, wincing and bleeding but never complaining. Boys, with their shorter styles, escaped some of the worst, but even they weren't spared the embarrassment of shared brushes, lice outbreaks at school, or the burning sting of kerosene rubbed into the scalp just in case. There's something grimly poetic about a society that treated its insects better than its women. The lice were never judged. The women were. If Clara's hair grew thin or patchy, if she scratched in public or flinched during brushing, she was at fault. Maybe she was overwrought, or too sensitive, or not ladylike enough, anything but a victim of a system that refused to prioritize actual health over the fantasy of propriety. And the solutions offered, even worse than the problem. Homemade lice tonics contain turpentine, lead salts, mercury and vinegar in various combinations. Some women tried rubbing onions into their scalps. Others used lard mixed with herbs. The most aggressive treatments involved shaving the head, but this was considered a last resort. Why? Because a bald woman in Victorian England was not a medical patient. She was a disgrace. Only nuns, prisoners and prostitutes had short hair, or women recovering from typhus. None of those were considered ideal comparisons. So instead, Clara continues the daily performance. Her hair, once thick and strong in childhood, has thinned from years of tight braiding, overcombing and chemical abuse. But she hides the bald patches with clever parting. She covers the hairline with powdered fringe. She knows how to angle herself so that no one notices. She has mastered camouflage like every respectable woman is expected to do. But the hair tells the truth eventually. By midlife, many Victorian women had traction, alopecia hair loss from repeated pulling. Others developed dermatitis from the oils and powders they used. Some suffered full-blown scalp infections that oozed through bonnets. And still, fashion guides advised more styles, higher buns, more feathers, bigger curls. And when the real hair ran out, wigs. Wigs were their own disaster. Often made from real human hair, sometimes from local donors, more often from the dead, they were heavy, hot, and difficult to clean. They came powdered, pre-styled, and perfumed to hide any underlying decomposition. Wearing one was like balancing a damp helmet on your head for 12 hours straight, and when you finally took it off, the smell lingered. Men wore wigs too, but with far less pressure. Their styles were simpler, their expectations lower. If a man had lice, he was unfortunate. If a woman had lice, she was unclean. This double standard wasn't just cultural, it was marketed. Advertisements from the era pushed hair tonics and perfumes for the lady's comfort and the gentleman's pride. Because a man's reputation rested on his bank account, a woman's rested on her scalp. And so, Eliza continues combing. She sees the nits. She feels the heat rising from Clara's skin. She knows that the brush she's using is spreading the problem, not fixing it. But she says nothing. She has no choice. To question the ritual is to question the system, and the system does not take kindly to backtalk. When she finishes, she steps back. Clara rises. Her head is heavy, but her posture is perfect. She looks clean, she smells expensive, and the itching, for now, is bearable. She nods her thanks. Eliza curtsies. The brush is returned to its place. Nothing is cleaned. Nothing is healed. Everything is preserved. Because in the end, Victorian hair care wasn't about hygiene. It was about hiding decay in plain sight. Chapter 5. The Myth of the Clean Gown. It's laundry day. Not that Clara notices. Laundry is not her concern. She sits in the drawing room, flipping through a book she won't finish, her skirts perfectly fanned across a polished chair, the smell of lavender water faint on her sleeves. Her gown is lovely silk, sky blue, with delicate embroidery at the hem. It looks immaculate, pristine, like it has just returned from a tailor's mannequin. What it actually smells like, if you get close enough, is week-old sweat buried under 2 layers of starch and a splash of imported perfume. This was the great Victorian illusion: clean gowns, spotless skirts, dresses that radiated elegance and refinement. But underneath, dirt, mould, insects, the unseen truth stitched into every hem. Let's unpack this. Victorian gowns weren't washed. Not regularly. Often not ever. At least not in the way we understand washing. A gown could cost a small fortune. Silk, lace, embroidery. These were fragile, handcrafted pieces, often custom-made, and nearly impossible to clean without damaging them. There was no gentle cycle, no dry cleaning, and no one was foolish enough to dunk a silk dress in a tub of hot water and hope for the best. Instead, gowns were refreshed, which is a polite way of saying they were aired out. Clara's gowns, like those of her peers, were hung by windows, shaken gently, maybe brushed with vinegar or lavender water. Stains were spot-treated, dabbed, not scrubbed. And if the gown was dark or patterned, well, lucky her. The dirt wouldn't show. As for the underlayers, the petticoats, the chemises, the shemsies, those absorbed most of the grime. But they too weren't washed as often as they should have been. In a respectable household, they might see water once a fortnight. In a poorer one, once a month. Some were worn so long they stiffened from absorbed body oil, holding their shape like papier-mâché. Still, as long as the top layer looked presentable, no one cared what was festering beneath, because Victorian cleanliness, like everything else in the era, was performative. A woman wasn't judged by what she cleaned. She was judged by what she could hide. Let's go to the laundry room. The soap is rough, made of animal fat and ash. It stings her hands. The water, lukewarm at best, quickly turns brown. Not from one gown, but from dozens of pieces layered beneath. The air smells like boiled wool and regret. Lace must be handled delicately, dried flat, pinned at the edges to prevent curling. Silk can't be washed at all, just sponged, maybe steamed. And sweat stains? They're a nightmare, especially under the arms, around the collar, near the waistline, anywhere skin meets fabric for longer than a polite moment. Eliza scrubs carefully, trying not to tear anything. If she ruins a piece, it's her pay. If she doesn't clean it well enough, it's her pride. Meanwhile, upstairs, Clara re-wears yesterday's gown with full confidence. Because it smells, not of her, but of the perfume. Eliza reapplied to the bodice seams. A trick every maid learns by her second week. Now, if you're wondering how a gown could go weeks without washing and still be considered clean, the answer is simple. No one got close enough to notice. Victorian social interaction was built around distance. No hugging, no spontaneous physicality. Women curtsied, men bowed. Gloves were worn at all times. Touch was limited. Scent was masked. If you maintained your distance, no one could call your bluff. This wasn't accidental. The fashion supported the farce. Dresses were designed to keep bodies apart. Crinolines, bustles, layers of tulle. They acted as elegant barriers, ensuring that no one brushed too close. Clara's skirt was a literal fortress, its circumference wider than most alleyways. She floated through parlours like a ship, graceful and untouchable, hiding the mildew beneath the sails. But not everything could be hidden. There were moments when the illusion failed. A warm summer evening, a crowded theatre, a sudden draught that lifted a skirt and released a scent so dense and human that even the most perfumed gentleman had to fight his gag reflex. But no one said a word. To acknowledge the smell was worse than to suffer it. It broke the spell. It reminded everyone that under the silken taffeta there was a body, real, sweating, flawed. So they smiled, dabbed at their temples with embroidered handkerchiefs, and praised the cut of the gown. This silence extended to illness. Skin rashes caused by unwashed fabric were diagnosed as nerves. Fungal infections from damp layers were never discussed. If a woman developed sores beneath her corset from fabric that hadn't dried properly, she might apply powder, wince through the pain, and continue hosting dinner guests with poise. To admit discomfort was to admit the system had cracks. And the Victorian system could not be cracked, even when gowns caused injury. And they did. No one challenged the structure. Dresses caught fire, women tripped, corsets bruised bones, petticoats dragged through sewage. But fashion magazines still preached elegance. Etiquette books insisted on cleanliness. Advice columns recommended brushing gowns with breadcrumbs rolled in milk. Yes, really, bread. Because wet cloth was too aggressive. The solutions were always absurd, never revolutionary. Better to sprinkle lemon juice on a stain than to redesign the garment that caused it. Better to air the petticoat than to admit it needed a good scrub. Better to spray perfume than to sweat less. Better to look clean than be clean. And the cost of this illusion? Labour. Hours upon hours of Eliza's time. Her back bent, her knuckles red, her nails cracked, her arms aching from wringing out fabric that weighed more wet than she did dry. But no one saw her. No one thanked her. Because Victorian elegance didn't recognise the work beneath it. Only the outcome. Clara knows her gowns aren't truly clean. But she also knows that to question the ritual is to question her place in the world, so she doesn't. She lets Eliza scrub. She powders her cuffs. She accepts compliments with a smile, pretending not to feel the fabric stiff from yesterday's sweat. Because in her world, as long as the gown looks good, everything else, smell, truth, pain, can be ironed over. Beneath the grandeur of the Victorian wardrobe lurked something both more honest and more horrifying than any fashion sketch would dare suggest. Fabric, soaked with human residue, folded and hung like relics of piety. Dresses, no matter how gilded or ruffled, bore witness to the daily contradictions women like Clara lived with, elegant on the outside, neglected on the inside. You see, the Victorian gown was never meant to be practical. It wasn't designed for walking long distances, or sitting comfortably, or heaven forbid sweating. And yet, the human body didn't ask for permission. It sweated anyway. It secreted oils. It shed skin. And as the hours turned into days, the gown absorbed all of it, like a silent accomplice. But still, no one dared wash them fully. Water and silk did not get along. Soap and embroidery had a mutual hatred. And the thought of taking a 12 dress, a month's wages for a labourer, and dunking it into a tub of scalding lye water, unthinkable. It would be like hosing down a chandelier. So instead, they aired them. Gowns were hung by open windows, sometimes turned inside out, left to be refreshed by the same city air filled with soot, coal smoke, and the unmistakable tang of horse manure. The irony was exquisite. Trying to cleanse a dress by exposing it to London's atmosphere was like trying to dry a sponge in the rain. But at least it was something. Other cleaning rituals were even stranger. Victorians believed in the spot clean philosophy. You didn't clean the whole dress, just the visibly dirty bits. You rubbed stains with stale bread, or brushed fabric with breadcrumbs and milk. Some used lemon juice or chalk. Others dusted cornstarch across sweaty collars and let it sit overnight to lift the odour. The next morning, it was brushed off like dandruff. Problem solved. Except the problem wasn't solved. It was shifted, from skin to cloth, from cloth to air, from one day to the next. And it didn't take long before dresses developed what Eliza, quietly and in private, called the weight. A heaviness in the fabric that wasn't from thread count or pleats, but from accumulation, layer upon layer of human residue. Clara's blue silk gown, for instance, was stunning from a distance. But hold it up to the light, and you'd see the outline of months, sometimes years of use, faint yellowing beneath the arms, a sheen of powder at the neckline, perfume that had darkened the seams. It wasn't filth exactly, it was memory. The worst part? The weight didn't just settle in the gown, it settled in the air. Drawing rooms, bedrooms, carriages, places where women gathered in their finest were not the fresh, lavender-scented spaces of period dramas. They were dense, smothering. The collective atmosphere of 20 gowns aired once a month, filled with powdered wigs, heavy skirts, perfumed gloves, and unrefrigerated bodies. And nobody opened a window, because that would let in the damp. Or worse, the miasma, that Victorian buzzword for any foul air thought to carry disease. The logic was impeccable. Better to sit in your own recycled sweat cloud than risk catching a breeze. But even in this madness there was structure. The outer gown might look perfect. It had to. That was the only visible layer. But what lay beneath the chemise, the corset cover, the drawers, wasn't just invisible, it was intentionally neglected. These were the layers closest to the body, the ones that bore the brunt of sweat, friction, and everything unspoken. And because they were hidden, they were considered unimportant. Eliza, as the laundress, knew better. She saw what these garments carried. She boiled the petticoats, scrubbed the underthings, held Clara's stained chemises with a gloved hand, and tried not to judge. But even she had limits. Some stains were older than her employment, some smells wouldn't lift. There were undergarments so thoroughly soaked with years of body oil that they had taken on a life of their own, permanently stiff, permanently human. And still, they were folded and returned to the wardrobe. Because laundry, like everything else in the Victorian world, was about hierarchy, the less visible something was, the less important it became. Even among the servants this hierarchy held. The parlourmaid wore a black dress daily. It was rarely washed. It was brushed, dusted, perfumed, never dunked in a basin. The kitchen maid, who dealt with blood, flour and grease, wore coarse cotton, washed more frequently but with less care. No starch. No ironing. Practical filth was tolerated. Social filth was camouflaged. This layered hypocrisy was written into the very design of the gowns. Take the bustle. A bizarre padded appendage strapped to the lower back, designed solely to give the illusion of volume. Functional as a pillow, laughable as an invention, it also trapped heat and sweat like a furnace. Clara's dresses with bustles were heavier, hotter, and often reeked more quickly, but they were fashionable. And fashion, as always, beat reason. And yet, through all of this, society insisted that Victorian women were paragons of grace, that they moved like swans, that they smelled like roses, that they never sweated, never itched, never tripped over their own underskirts. Entire novels were written describing heroines who smelled faintly of violets while fainting into the arms of gallant men. In truth, they smelled faintly of violets and strongly of mildew, hair oil, dust, and fabric that hadn't been truly clean in a decade. Still, the myth held, because acknowledging the truth meant undoing the entire performance. And no one was ready to admit that what they admired was, in fact, a costume, one that carried mould spores and foot odour. By the time Clara changes her gown for the evening, swapping one illusion for another, Eliza is already preparing to freshen it. She will brush it down, turn it inside out, sprinkle it with vinegar and starch, and hang it by the window. If it rains, she'll move it to the hearth. If the perfume bottle runs low, she'll dilute it with gin. Nothing is thrown away. Nothing is truly cleaned. Just carefully, meticulously, ritualistically disguised. Chapter 6. Onion pillows and urine facials. There are few things more unsettling than the human capacity to adapt, to normalize, to rationalize, to build ritual out of discomfort. But nowhere is this instinct more vivid, more theatrical, than in the private hygiene practices of Victorian women. Beneath the chandeliers and silken skirts, behind the lace gloves and powdered faces, there lived habits so bizarre, so quietly grotesque, that even the servants who witnessed them never quite said them aloud. Let us begin with the pillow, not the decorative kind, embroidered with initials and trimmed with lace. No, we speak of the one tucked secretly beneath the main cushion, sometimes hidden within the pillowcase itself. There, nestled against the cheekbones of women like Clara while they slept, lay a common household item with an uncommon purpose, a peeled onion. Yes, an onion. Raw, sharp, eye-watering, placed with deliberate care near the mouth or beneath the chin, night after night. Why? Because it was believed to purify the breath, the idea being that the pungent bulb would draw out foul odours from the body during sleep, acting as a kind of nocturnal detoxifier. It was not science, it was not effective, but it was routine. And in a world where brushing teeth was optional and dental care non-existent, routine was the closest thing to hope. And Clara, ever obedient to etiquette and tradition, followed it religiously. Each night she wrapped a sliver of onion in linen, slipped it beneath her pillow, and closed her eyes, pretending she could not smell it, pretending that her breath in the morning would be fresh, ladylike, suitable for whispered conversations over tea. Eliza, on the other hand, found it absurd, not because she knew better, but because her own mother used orange peels instead, the citrus version of the same ritual. Dried and curled, placed beneath the pillow, or stitched into sachets tucked into corsets, the orange peel was gentler but equally useless. The goal wasn't health, it was illusion. And when it came to skincare, the illusion took a darker turn. Clara's complexion, porcelain in daylight and velvety under gaslight, did not come from rest or diet or anything remotely natural. It came from something most modern audiences would consider unspeakable. A yellowish liquid stored in a small glass vial on her vanity, human urine, distilled, aged slightly, and applied with a soft cloth. No, this isn't exaggeration. This was the logic of the time. Urine was believed to soften skin, clear blemishes, and even draw out toxins from the surface. Women used their own, or that of children, collected discreetly and stored in bottles labelled as floral water. The ammonia content in stale urine acted as a mild cleanser and bleaching agent, and so it was patted gently onto cheeks, chins, and foreheads, followed of course by a veil of powder and a generous helping of perfume. It is almost comical in its horror. To imagine Clara, eyes closed, gently patting her face with liquid waste in the name of beauty, is to understand the full absurdity of the Victorian obsession with appearances. She hated the smell. She hated the stickiness. But she did it anyway, because somewhere in an etiquette manual or a fashion column, some Parisian beauty had whispered that this was the secret, and Clara wanted to be beautiful, needed to be, because beauty was more than vanity, it was protection. In a society where women had no vote, no property, no legal independence, the body became their currency. A good complexion could mean a better marriage, safer treatment, kinder company. A blemish, a boil, a scar, that was weakness. That was vulnerability. So the rituals persisted. Another favourite? Ashes. Wood ash, preferably from fruit trees, was mixed with rainwater to create a kind of exfoliating paste. This was used to scrub elbows, knees, and other rough areas. The idea being that the ash would slough off dead skin and leave behind a polished glow. What it actually left was microabrasions, chemical burns, and a fine layer of soot. But again, it was normal. Praised, even. Eliza sometimes helped with this. She hated it, especially in winter when Clara's skin cracked from cold and ash. But she followed orders. Rubbed the paste into Clara's arms, dabbed it behind her ears, whispered apologies when Clara flinched. The mistress never thanked her. That wasn't part of the ritual. And then there were the powders. Powders were the backbone of Victorian self-care. They absorbed sweat, masked odours, softened skin, at least in theory. But the powders themselves were riddled with toxins. Many were laced with lead, mercury, arsenic. Substances that, over time, caused hair loss, skin discoloration, neurological damage, and premature death, all in pursuit of that pale matte finish. Clara owned 5 different powders, each stored in an ornate tin. She never left the house without applying one to her face, her neck, her wrists, even her underarms. Powder was not a choice. It was armour. And when it made her sick, when her skin turned raw, when her hair thinned, when her gums bled, she assumed it was just part of aging. No one told her otherwise. Doctors rarely warned of the risks. Those who did were dismissed. Who would trust a man in a lab coat over a lady in a bonnet? Criticism was unladylike. Doubt was dangerous. And so the absurdity flourished. Other oddities filled Clara's bedroom. A jar of snails, from which she sometimes collected mucus for applying to chapped lips. A sachet of bay leaves slicked into her bodice to mask body odour. A pair of leather gloves lined with vinegar-soaked cotton, worn at night to whiten the hands. Every drawer, every pouch, held something slightly repulsive, wearing the mask of elegance. And none of it was ever spoken aloud. That, perhaps, is the most Victorian trait of all. The silence. Not the rituals themselves, but the refusal to question them. No one asked why women were rubbing soot on their elbows, or placing onions near their mouths, or coating their skin with poisons. They just did it, with grace, with restraint, with their mouths closed and their gloves on, because propriety wasn't just a costume, it was a muzzle. And Clara, wrapped in powder and ash, whispering her nightly prayers into a pillow that reeked of onion, never once considered stopping, because to stop would be to stand apart. And in Victorian society, standing apart was more dangerous than anything hiding beneath her skin. Morning arrives again in the manor, and the onion is discarded. Not ceremoniously. Just quietly, with a soft thud into the fire grate or waste bin. Clara never mentions it to her guests. Eliza never asks where the peels go. It's simply gone, as if it had never been there. Like most of the rituals Victorian women performed daily to maintain the illusion that cleanliness was natural, effortless, and perfumed. This is where the reality grows more absurd. Because these weren't just quirky habits, they were a language, a silent grammar of hygiene that spoke volumes through what wasn't said. An entire generation of women navigating the stink of biology through a system of rituals that belonged more in a medieval apothecary than a 19th century dressing room, and none more so than the routine Clara followed on her face every morning. It began with the powder, always the powder. Lead-based, finely milled, applied with a puff of rabbit fur or swan feathers. It came in soft creams and pearlescent white, designed to give the illusion of smooth, poreless perfection. But there was a problem. The skin underneath, constantly coated, never exposed, began to rebel. It grew dry, inflamed, it peeled, cracked. It flaked off in corners of the mouth and around the nose like old wallpaper. But rather than reduce the powder, Clara applied more. Of course she did, because paleness meant purity. And purity, as we know by now, was never meant to be comfortable. The cycle continued. Powder dried the skin. Skin cracked. Powder was reapplied. If it stung, that meant it was working. This too was normal. But when the powder began to fail, when it could no longer hide the irritation, Clara reached for more aggressive solutions. Arsenic wafers, for example. These were sold in apothecaries and beauty shops, advertised to brighten the eyes and soften the complexion. They worked. Temporarily. They also poisoned the blood and led to systemic organ failure if taken for too long. But no one warned her. If they did, they were ignored. After all, if it came from a shop window and had a label, surely it was safe. And then there was the lead-based lotion. Applied to the face, it promised to erase freckles and restore youth. What it actually did was sink into the skin, damage the nerves, and cause insomnia, confusion, and sometimes death, a trade-off that might seem irrational to modern ears. But in Victorian society, where aging was failure and blemishes were moral failings, it made perfect sense, because nothing was more terrifying to a woman like Clara than being seen as natural. Let that sink in. It wasn't illness, discomfort, or even injury that frightened her. It was honesty, truth, the audacity of appearing as she was, instead of as society demanded she be. This fear didn't come from nowhere. Beauty manuals from the era are filled with instructions so precise and controlling, they read more like engineering diagrams than advice. Apply powder from left to right only. Blot with lace, not cotton. Rub in rose water 3 times, counterclockwise, using only the middle and ring fingers. No detail was too small. Every act of grooming was codified, standardized, and enforced, not by law, but by expectation, by the gaze of the other women in the room, by the judgment of men whose own hygiene routines rarely exceeded a splash of cold water and a dab of pomade. And so the rituals grew stranger, more desperate. Some women swore by egg whites for a temporary tightening effect. They painted it on before parties, letting it dry into a thin, glassy sheen that cracked if they laughed too hard. Others used raw meat, yes, meat pressed to the face to draw out heat and restore bloom. Slices of veal or beef, chilled and laid like grotesque masks in the dark. It sounds like parody. It wasn't. Eliza once found Clara asleep with a strip of calf's liver on her cheek. She said nothing, removed it, disposed of it, sprinkled rose water across the pillow and smoothed the sheets. Because servants weren't just cleaning up filth, they were maintaining delusions. And let's not forget the soaps, such as they were. Homemade lye soap was brutal, caustic, made by boiling wood ash with animal fat. It scoured more than it cleansed. Eliza used it on laundry and floors. But sometimes, in desperation, Clara used it on her face. Just a tiny bit, she'd say, to scrub away the dullness. The burning sensation was immediate. But again, that was part of the ritual. Pain meant purity. She'd finish the process with vinegar, dabbed carefully onto red, tender skin. The vinegar was supposed to tighten the pores. In truth, it just dried the skin further, made it flake, made it bleed when too much powder was pressed on top the next morning. But it didn't matter, because she looked radiant by candlelight. And candlelight, like Victorian morality, was very good at hiding rot. There's something bleakly poetic in all this. Women were never told they were enough, not once. Not without product, not without sacrifice. They were not human, they were projects. Maintenance was never-ending. Success was invisible. Failure had a smell. And this extended beyond the home. At public events, balls, galas, concerts, every woman present was a walking battleground of self-management, each gown hiding chafed thighs, each corset cinched over bruised ribs, each face powdered over a rash, a scar, or the soft fungal bloom of too many nights spent sleeping in sweat. And when they returned home, they placed another onion beneath their pillow, swabbed their cheeks with stale urine, applied another layer of arsenic cream, hoping tomorrow they'd wake up a little paler, a little smoother, a little closer to the fantasy sold to them by society. Clara never questioned this. Why would she? Her mother did the same. So did her grandmother. So would her daughters. In her mind, discomfort was the toll for dignity. Beauty was the gatekeeper to love, security, survival. She wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to exist. And Eliza, watching from the doorway, said nothing. Again, because to question the rituals would be to question the world. And in Victorian England, the world was always right, no matter how wrong it smelled. Chapter 7. The Monthly Silence. No one survived. There are silences, and then there are voids. In Victorian England, the silence around menstruation was not just avoidance. It was policy. It was structure. It was a deliberately unspoken abyss buried beneath every corset, every hemline, every proper smile. Clara, like every other woman of her time, lived with this silence once a month, or rather, she endured it. The body, of course, didn't care for etiquette. It bled anyway, but there was no language to wrap around it. No vocabulary for discomfort, for pain, for stain, for the deep, gnawing ache that gripped Clara low in the spine and radiated outward like a whisper. She was not permitted to speak. Menstruation wasn't shameful. It was unspeakable. Too vulgar to be addressed in newspapers. Too unseemly for medicine. Too dangerous to discuss with even one's closest female friends. The result was a cycle of confusion, secrecy, and deeply personal suffering that repeated every month across millions of women, none of whom were allowed to admit it was happening. For Clara, the first signs came quietly. A faint cramp, a sense of pressure, a heaviness in her legs. She would excuse herself from tea, sit upright in her chair to disguise the pain, and wait for the bleeding to begin. When it did, she wrapped herself in even more layers of cloth, of linen, of silence. There were no sanitary pads, no tampons, no commercial products of any kind. What Clara had was a bundle of old cotton rags, stiff, often reused, folded tight and held in place by friction, prayer, and the architecture of her undergarments. They were called clouts, or lady cloths, and they were passed down, repurposed, hidden in drawers like smuggled contraband. They had to be washed in secret, boiled if one had the luxury, scrubbed by hand if one didn't, but never aired in view, never acknowledged aloud. Even among women, it was impolite to discuss one's courses. At most, they might whisper about my time or a visit from my cousin. The metaphors varied, but the implication was the same: say anything except the truth. And so Clara bled quietly, moved slowly, sat carefully. She checked her skirts obsessively for leaks, used perfumed cloths to mask any smell, and prayed that her dress remained unstained. Because a stain, however small, was a social death sentence. It meant being whispered about, laughed at, remembered. Even husbands rarely knew the details. Married women like Clara often kept a second drawer in their wardrobe for those items. Some locked it. Others kept it under the bed, wrapped in dark fabric. It wasn't the mess that shamed them. It was the knowledge that they had a mess. To be known as bleeding, even by the man who shared your bed, was considered indecent. And yet, the mess was constant. On heavier days, Clara could feel the cloth shift beneath her layers. She walked slower. She winced at every step. The pressure of the corset made things worse, but to loosen it would be unthinkable. A woman in public without proper structure might as well be naked. So she bore it. She smiled through it. She powdered her face and hosted dinners with a churning abdomen and a blood-soaked rag folded beneath her skirts. Eliza, in the servant quarters, had it worse. She didn't have multiple cloths. She had one. 2, if she was lucky. And when they were too stained to reuse, she rinsed them in cold water, wrung them out, and used them again. Wet, uncomfortable but necessary. There was no privacy to change them, no medical advice, just a shared basin and an iron stomach. When infections happened, and they did, they were explained away as women's weakness. Doctors, when consulted, gave vague recommendations: rest, a change in air, a quieter disposition. They never examined. They never questioned. Because menstruation wasn't just taboo, it was invisible to medicine. Women who bled too heavily were considered hysterical. Women who didn't bleed were considered barren. And those who bled in pain month after month were told they were exaggerating, that it was part of being a woman, that perhaps their corset was too loose, that perhaps they were reading too many novels. The reality was darker. Many women developed chronic pelvic infections, abscesses, anemia, or worse. The lack of hygiene around menstruation led to long-term damage that no one connected to the actual cause, because no one was allowed to name the cause. And what cannot be named cannot be solved. Even childbirth didn't free women from this ignorance. Postpartum bleeding was misunderstood. Menstrual irregularities were seen as signs of divine imbalance. Midwives, when allowed to assist, offered folk remedies, herbs, poultices, whispered prayers. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. But they were the only support system most women had, and through it all, society pretended nothing was happening. Etiquette books instructed women never to discuss bodily matters in front of men or other women unless absolutely necessary. If a stain appeared on a chair cushion, it was blamed on wine. If a cloth was found soaking in a basin, it was for polishing. If a woman fainted from cramps, she was overwrought. The euphemisms were endless and exhausting. But Clara played her part. She maintained her schedule. She attended functions. She stood in church, knees trembling, hands clasped in prayer, stomach clenched tight against the slow, persistent drip that was soaking through her fourth layer of fabric. And she never said a word. That silence became its own inheritance. Young girls were never told what to expect. They discovered it by accident. A stain on their chemise, a red mark in the wash basin, panic, shame. The quiet guidance of an older woman, delivered in hushed tones with eyes that said, "Never tell anyone." And so the cycle continued. Pain without language, blood without explanation, suffering without support. There were, of course, rumours of alternatives. Sponges soaked in vinegar, seaweed pads imported from the coast, rubber undergarments rumoured to exist in Parisian shops. But these were whispers, hearsay. The average woman had cloth and willpower and not much else. And when the cloth failed, when the blood ran hot and fast and unstoppable, Clara excused herself. She sat in a private room, clutching her knees, sweat on her brow, breath shallow, praying for the pain to pass before anyone noticed. Eliza would find the cloth later, soaked, folded, rinsed without comment. It would hang behind the stove overnight, stiffening as it dried. It was not clean, but it was ready. Ready for the next month, the next silence, because in the grand theatre of Victorian womanhood, even your blood had to learn its lines. The silence surrounding menstruation was not simply cultural, it was institutional. It ran so deep that even medical textbooks of the Victorian period barely mentioned it. When they did, the descriptions were vague, evasive, wrapped in euphemisms so thick they might as well have been written in code. One popular medical guide for women, published in the 1870s, referred to menstruation as a monthly cleansing of superfluous humours. Another dismissed severe cramps as the result of nervous excitability, implying that women were too emotional to handle their own cycles. No diagrams, no practical advice, just a tone that suggested women's pain was both inevitable and unworthy of serious attention. For Clara, this translated into endurance. No doctor was going to offer her remedies beyond rest, and maybe a spoonful of laudanum if she fainted. No clergyman was going to speak of it, except perhaps in sermons about women's inherent weakness. No etiquette book would dare to offer tips beyond, "A lady will retire discreetly should she find herself indisposed." So she relied on cloths, perfume sachets, and sheer willpower. Her daughter would too, and her granddaughter after her. Because the silence wasn't just personal, it was generational. Eliza, in her servants' quarters, had her own monthly ordeal. Unlike Clara, she had no perfumed handkerchief to disguise the odour, no drawer of neatly folded rags set aside just for her use. She had one cloth washed in cold water and reused until it literally fell apart, and when it did, she cut a piece from an old shift, folded it, and started the cycle again. It was all she could afford, all she was allowed. And if the blood stained through her skirts while she worked, she risked reprimand or dismissal. Not for being unclean, but for being visible. That was the true Victorian sin visibility. The body was meant to be invisible. Its needs, its rhythms, its bleeding. All hidden beneath layers of fabric, beneath polite smiles, beneath layers of lavender water and powdered cheeks. A stain was not simply an accident. It was a crack in the facade. A betrayal of the illusion that women were delicate porcelain dolls untouched by biology. This illusion had consequences, terrible ones. Infections were common. Cloths were rarely sterilized, often dried damp, folded, and reused while still harboring bacteria. Chronic pelvic infections spread silently, dismissed as female complaints. Women developed fevers, rashes, abscesses, even septicemia, without ever receiving proper treatment. And yet, because these illnesses were tied to menstruation, they were buried under euphemisms. Better to let women suffer quietly than to risk indecency by naming what was happening. Even worse, the silence created ignorance. Girls reached puberty with no preparation. They woke one morning to blood on their sheets and thought they were dying. Some fainted, some screamed, others cried in secret. And when they asked their mothers, the response was often little more than, "It happens to all women. Do not speak of it." Imagine being 13, terrified, in pain, and told not to mention it again. That was the education system Victorian society provided. This ignorance had ripple effects. Men grew up equally clueless, shielded from the realities of the female body. Husbands who discovered cloths soaking in basins reacted with shock or disgust. Some accused their wives of being ill, diseased, or morally unclean. The stigma deepened, and the silence tightened. And yet, amidst this silence, rituals still emerged. Some women believed that placing an onion or an orange peel near their pillow during menstruation could draw out impurities. Others sipped herbal teas, chamomile, pennyroyal, mugwort, hoping to ease cramps. Some methods worked mildly. Others were dangerous. Pennyroyal, for instance, was a known abortifacient. Taken in excess, it poisoned the liver. But desperate women had little guidance, so they experimented. Anything was better than nothing. Then there was vinegar applied everywhere, in every possible way. Some women soaked their cloths in it before use, convinced it would reduce odour and prevent disease. Others dabbed it onto their skin directly to cleanse the pores. Clara herself used vinegar-soaked cloths on heavy days, grimacing at the sting, but reassured by the sharp scent that convinced her she was safe. In reality, it did little beyond making the pain worse. And yet, she repeated the ritual every month, because not repeating it would have felt reckless, because she had no alternatives, because silence had left her with nothing but superstition. The silence didn't just protect ignorance, it enforced it. Newspapers refused to print advertisements for menstrual products when the first prototypes appeared. Doctors avoided lectures on the subject. Even midwives were careful in how they described it. The very word menstruation was considered indecent for polite conversation. Better to invent euphemisms, the monthlies, the curse, a woman's burden. Each phrase vague enough to disguise the truth, yet heavy enough to reinforce the shame. And so the cycle endured. Every month, Clara carried her folded rags into the drawing room, hosting guests while sitting painfully upright. She laughed at jokes, sipped tea, and forced smiles, while blood soaked quietly beneath her silk gown. She did not excuse herself unless absolutely necessary. To retreat too often would arouse suspicion. And suspicion, in Victorian society, was worse than suffering. Eliza scrubbed the evidence after. She boiled the rags in lye water, the acrid steam stinging her eyes, while trying not to gag at the smell. She wrung them out with cracked red hands and hung them to dry where no one would see. She did this for herself too when her own time came. There was no dignity in it, just survival. The monthly silence was not just endured, it was policed, protected, reinforced by everyone from husbands who turned their heads, to doctors who wrote nothing, to servants who pretended not to notice. And that silence became a cage, a prison made not of iron but of omission. And perhaps the cruelest irony? This silence persisted even as women were praised for their endurance, for their grace, for their ability to smile through pain. Men marvelled at their composure, never realizing that it wasn't composure at all. It was compulsion. It was the weight of a system that demanded silence so loudly it drowned out every cry. The monthly silence, then, was not a personal burden. It was a cultural law, and no woman, Clara, Eliza, or anyone else ever truly survived it. Chapter 8, One Brush, Many Mouths. If the Victorian world had a single object that revealed its quiet indifference to hygiene, it was not the corset or the gown. It was something smaller, more intimate, more deceptively ordinary. The toothbrush. Or rather, the toothbrush. Singular. Because in many households, there wasn't one for each person. There was one for everyone. Clara's family kept theirs in a shallow dish on the washstand, a stiff, bristled contraption with a bone handle, worn down at the edges from years of use. In the morning, she would dip it in a little water, rub it into powdered chalk or soot, and drag it across her teeth. When she was finished, she rinsed it, set it back in the dish, and left it there for her husband. He used the same brush. Her daughter used it next. Guests sometimes, too, if they stayed overnight and were considered close enough to the family. One brush, many mouths. If you're shuddering, good, you should, because this was not an anomaly. This was common. Toothbrushes were expensive, imported, and treated as household property rather than personal necessities. They were never sanitized. They were never replaced until they fell apart. They were shared like cups of tea or hymn books. No one questioned it. And so colds passed through families like wildfire. So did mouth infections, gum diseases, and whatever else lingered on the bristles. But no one made the connection. The Victorians didn't understand bacteria, not really. Germ theory existed, yes, but it was slow to be accepted and even slower to be applied. To them, illness came from bad air or nervous conditions, not from a toothbrush swapped between 3 people before breakfast. Clara believed her mouth was clean. After all, the powder left her teeth looking white, at least temporarily. That the abrasive chalk scraped away enamel with each stroke, leaving her teeth sensitive and prone to decay, was not her concern. She couldn't feel that damage right away. What she could feel was the faint burn of peppermint oil added to her powder. Cleanliness, in her mind, was not an absence of disease. It was a sensation, a sting. And yet, decay was everywhere. Most Victorian mouths were disasters. Blackened teeth, missing molars, swollen gums. Even the wealthy suffered, perfume and lace doing nothing to disguise the rot beneath their smiles. In fact, sugar, an indulgence of the wealthy, made their dental problems worse. Sweet tea, sugared biscuits, cakes at every social call. Decay was the price of refinement, just as sweat was the price of fashion. Dentistry was hardly a solution. It was punishment. There were no anaesthetics early in the century, no sterile tools. To have a tooth pulled meant gripping the arms of a chair until your knuckles went white, while a barber surgeon wrenched the offending molar from your skull with iron pliers. If you were lucky, it came out quickly. If not, the roots broke. Infections followed. Some were fatal. And yet, routine care, the kind that might have prevented all this, was almost non-existent. Brushing once a day was considered excessive. Some brushed only once a week, many not at all. Mouthwashes existed, but they were brutal mixtures of vinegar, spirits, or even ammonia. They burned more than they cleansed. Clara kept a small vial of rose water for rinsing, a luxury few could afford. It didn't kill germs, it only masked them. But that was enough. Masking was always enough. Eliza's experience was harsher. In the servant quarters there was no toothbrush at all. A rag dipped in salt water, rubbed across the teeth, had to suffice. Sometimes, if she was fortunate, A single shared brush was provided for the entire staff. It was used, rinsed, and replaced, as communal as the pitcher of drinking water they all shared. She hated the feeling of bristles stiff with someone else's spit, but saying no wasn't an option. Not brushing at all was worse. This was the double bind of Victorian hygiene, damned if you did, damned if you didn't. Use the tools available and you risked spreading disease. Avoid them and you risked being called unclean. There was no winning, just suffering in silence, hoping the pain in your gums subsided before it rotted into something worse. And worse it often became. Abscesses were common. Gums swelled, pus drained, breath soured. A polite lady would never admit to this, of course. She would dab peppermint oil on her tongue, chew cloves, or place a sprig of parsley in her mouth before a social visit. The illusion of freshness mattered more than the reality of infection. Even at a ball, surrounded by silk and perfume, the air was often thick with the sweet metallic scent of blood and decay, masked poorly by peppermint. Dentists, or those calling themselves dentists, advertised miracle powders and elixirs in newspapers. Most were mixtures of chalk, brick dust, and chemicals we would never dream of putting in our mouths today. Some contained hydrochloric acid. Yes, acid. The idea was to whiten teeth by stripping away the enamel. It worked. Briefly, until the teeth, brittle and eroded, cracked or collapsed entirely. By then, of course, the patient had already bought another jar. And yet, despite all this, the Victorian smile was considered alluring, not because it was healthy, but because it was rare. A woman who could smile without revealing blackened stumps was admired, envied, whispered about as blessed. Clara's teeth, though not perfect, were still intact. She thanked her powders, her shared brush, her rosewater rinse. She didn't know that her enamel was thinning. She didn't care. She could smile in candlelight without embarrassment, and that was enough. Criticism of this system was muted. A few reformers pushed for personal toothbrushes, for more frequent cleaning, for better dental care. They were ignored. Too fussy, too French, too modern. The idea that each person should have their own brush seemed indulgent, almost decadent, like having your own chamber pot. Why not share? Wasn't family unity built on trust? And what's more trusting than swapping germs at breakfast? The sarcasm writes itself. So the cycle endured. One brush, many mouths, many infections. Eliza knew the risks. She saw the gums bleed, the teeth loosen. She saw her fellow servants lose molars in their 20s, struggle with constant pain, learn to chew on one side of their mouths for the rest of their lives. And yet she brushed when she could, not because it helped, but because not brushing meant smelling poor, and smelling poor meant being dismissed. Clara's family, meanwhile, carried on with their rituals, never questioning the bone-handled brush in its dish, never wondering how many mouths had scraped against its bristles that week. They believed they were clean. They believed they were refined. And perhaps that belief was the most Victorian thing of all, the conviction that illusion mattered more than truth. The toothbrush in Clara's household was not an object of intimacy. It was an object of utility, as impersonal as a spoon, and as shared as the family Bible. To us, it feels almost nightmarish, this idea of passing bristles from mouth to mouth. But in Victorian England, it was simply routine, a quiet, unquestioned symbol of how little personal hygiene was understood and how deeply appearances mattered over reality. Clara would take the brush each morning with the same gentle grace she used in pouring tea. Dip it in water, roll it in chalk, press it to her teeth. She would hum softly as she worked, not because she enjoyed the task, but because humming made her jaw ache less. When she was finished, she wiped the handle with a cloth and placed it neatly back in the dish. She never asked who would use it next. That wasn't her concern. Her husband, Mr. Run, Blackwood, used it next. He dragged it across his own teeth, slower, rougher, gritting as chalk scraped enamel. Then he rinsed it in the same basin of water Clara had dipped into. Sometimes the bristles carried faint flecks of red gum blood from a small cut or a swelling. He noticed perhaps, but said nothing. Blood was common, a sign that the powder was working. Their daughter, Emma, only 10, was encouraged to brush occasionally. It makes the teeth bright, Clara reminded her. Bright, not healthy. That was the goal. The brush was too large for Emma's mouth. She gagged as she tried to reach her back teeth. The chalk powder spilled across her dress. Clara smiled anyway, patting her head. Good girl. She would learn, in time, to endure the discomfort. Eliza rarely touched the family brush, unless ordered. She had her own ritual, less refined, more desperate. A rag dipped in ash water, rubbed across her teeth in quick motions before she hurried back to work. She hated the taste. Bitter, chemical, faintly metallic. But at least it scrubbed away the worst of the grease from yesterday's bread and lard. At least it gave her some defence against the constant worry of smelling unclean. And still, despite all this brushing, Victorian mouths were battlegrounds of decay. By the age of 30, Clara's friends often had mouths lined with gaps, molars missing from years of sugar and neglect. They covered their smiles with gloved hands or fans. If a toothache grew too unbearable, they visited a barber surgeon. The procedure was brutal. Forceps clamped around the offending tooth, a swift yank, and a scream that echoed down the street. No anesthetic, no sterilization, just blood, sweat, and the risk of infection. Women fainted, men drank gin before the appointment, children cried, and afterward life went on. Some sought alternatives, tooth powders, sold in shops and advertised in newspapers. They promised miracle cures, fresh breath, gleaming enamel. Most were scams. A mix of brick dust, oyster shell, pumice, and a few drops of flavouring. Some included hydrochloric acid to whiten teeth by stripping away the surface. They worked briefly until the teeth eroded. Then came the abscesses, the swelling, the slow grinding agony. But by then, of course, the apothecary had sold another jar. And still, people believed. They had to. The idea that hygiene could be personal, that each individual deserved their own tools, was foreign. Hygiene was communal, shared, performed. You brushed to appear respectable, not to stay healthy. The irony is sharp. Victorian society praised women for their refinement, for their sweet-smelling breaths, their delicate voices, their polished smiles. Yet those same smiles often hid rotting gums and loose teeth. Breath was disguised with cloves or peppermint lozenges. Powder masked the yellow stains of enamel rubbed raw. The appearance was maintained even as the foundation crumbled. Mr. Blackwood often carried peppermint-soaked cloths in his pocket. He would chew them during meetings, believing his breath fresh, his authority unchallenged. Clara powdered her mouth with violet lozenges, more perfume than medicine. Emma sucked sugar cubes dipped in peppermint oil. Each ritual masked the truth. None solved it, and the consequences were devastating. Infections that began in the teeth spread. Without antibiotics, they moved quickly through the jaw into the blood. Sepsis. Death. All from a single rotten tooth. Entire obituaries began with words like a lingering illness or a fever, when the real culprit was a mouth ignored until it killed. Yet the family brush sat proudly on the washstand, as if it were the pinnacle of modern civility. Guests noticed it. They admired it. Ah, how refined, they said, seeing the ivory handle, the neat bristles, never questioning that it carried saliva from 3 mouths, never daring to suggest that each person might need their own, because in the Victorian mind, refinement was measured not by science, but by symbolism. You weren't healthy because you brushed. You were refined because you owned a brush at all. This attitude extended beyond the family. Boarding houses often kept one brush for all tenants. Schools, one brush per dormitory. Hospitals, one brush for entire wards. The very places meant to heal and protect spread disease by insisting on the illusion of hygiene. But no one challenged it. To do so would have seemed pedantic, even rude. And here lies the core of Victorian hygiene: politeness over truth, respectability over reality. Sharing a brush wasn't just normal, it was a moral act, a sign of family unity, of shared refinement. Germs had no place in this equation. They weren't understood. They weren't acknowledged. The only contagion that mattered was the fear of appearing uncouth. Clara, of course, believed she was clean. She believed Emma was learning good habits. She believed her family's smiles were enviable, admirable, even beautiful. And in candlelight, perhaps they were. But beneath the glow, beneath the powders and perfumes, there was another truth. one of decay, of infection, of disease, waiting quietly at the edge of the gums. And still, the brush waited in its dish. Tomorrow it would scrape across another mouth. Tomorrow it would carry another trace of blood. Tomorrow it would be wiped, rinsed, replaced, as if nothing had happened. Because in Victorian England, the appearance of health was always worth more than health itself. Chapter 9. Bedrooms of Velvet and Vermin. Clara's bedroom was a masterpiece of appearances. Heavy velvet curtains hung from ceiling to floor, trimmed in tassels that brushed the carpet like vines. The carpet itself, a thick weave imported from the continent, muffled every step, absorbing sound the way it absorbed everything else. Dust, sweat, food crumbs, and years of unwashed air. The bed stood like a centerpiece, four-poster, draped in silk, layered with quilts, pillows and canopies so heavy they seemed designed less for rest and more for display. To the visitor it looked opulent. To Clara it was familiar. To Eliza, who cleaned it, it was a battlefield. Victorian bedrooms were illusions of comfort. They looked soft, elegant and luxurious, but beneath the polish lurked decay. Carpets that had never seen soap, curtains that had never been washed, only beaten outside occasionally with sticks, bedding stuffed with horsehair or feathers, dampened over the years by sweat, never properly aired, mattresses that, once slit open, revealed colonies of insects, mites, fleas, even mice, living in the dark warmth beneath the sheets. It sounds grotesque, but it was routine. Take the curtains. Heavy fabrics were prized because they kept out draughts, which Victorians feared with religious fervour. Draughts, they believed, carried disease. The heavier the curtain, the safer the household. But thick drapery was also the perfect trap for dust and smoke. Every candle burned, every coal fire lit, added to the film of soot clinging to the fabric. Over time, these curtains didn't just darken the room, they poisoned the air. Clara would draw hers each night, cocooning herself in stale breath, dust, and velvet fibres, all the while believing she was safe from illness. Then there were the carpets. Wall to wall in wealthy homes, they created the illusion of warmth and prosperity. But with no vacuum cleaners, no proper cleaning systems, they were impossible to maintain. Beating them outside released plumes of filth thick enough to choke an entire street. Yet indoors, those same carpets remained, trapping the footprints of years, the spillage of dinners, the flakes of human skin. Each step Clara took stirred up invisible clouds that she inhaled without ever realizing it. The bed was no better. Beds were rarely stripped completely, not in wealthy homes. Sheets might be changed once a fortnight, pillowcases less often. Quilts and blankets lingered for months, sometimes years, without a proper wash. Doctors occasionally warned about foul air trapped in bedding, linking it to respiratory illness, but most people dismissed such warnings. Beds were sanctuaries, they believed. To wash them too frequently risked draining one's vitality. Better to let them be. Better to sleep among vermin than to tempt fate. And vermin there were. Mattresses were notorious breeding grounds. Stuffed with horsehair, wool or feathers, they offered warmth, darkness and food in the form of human sweat. Bedbugs thrived. Lice migrated from scalp to pillow and back again. Fleas jumped from pets to sheets. Clara's mattress, which she had slept on for nearly a decade, was alive in ways she chose not to think about. She smelled the faint sourness sometimes, noticed the itching on her legs, but told herself it was nothing. All women itched. It was part of life. Eliza knew better. She stripped the sheets when instructed, wrinkling her nose at the damp, heavy smell that clung to them. She shook out the quilts, beat the pillows, turned the mattress. She saw the specks crawling in the seams, but she said nothing. She could not say anything. A servant who suggested her mistress's bed was dirty would not keep her job long. So she smiled, smoothed the sheets, and tucked the blankets tight, leaving the infestation hidden, polite, invisible. And the irony? This was refinement. The more fabric in a room, the more respectable it looked. Heavy curtains, upholstered chairs, canopied beds. These were status symbols. They screamed wealth, elegance, comfort. Guests admired them. Visitors gushed about them. They were marks of civility. No one mentioned the smell, the itching, the musty air thick enough to choke. because acknowledging it would mean questioning the very definition of refinement. And refinement, as ever, mattered more than truth. Doctors, when consulted about bedroom hygiene, offered conflicting advice. Some urged families to air bedding, to let in sunlight, to beat mattresses in the garden. Others insisted that drafts and sun were dangerous, that darkness and warmth preserved health. Families chose whichever advice suited their preferences. Clara's family chose warmth. Her curtains stayed closed, her windows shut. Every night she slept in air already breathed a dozen times, thick with her own exhalations and the hidden life in her mattress. This environment had consequences. Respiratory illnesses were rampant. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, chronic coughs, all thrived in bedrooms filled with stale air and dust. Children grew up coughing through the night. Women, confined to the home more than men, breathed it in for longer hours, weakening their lungs. Yet, society rarely made the connection. Illness was blamed on weak constitutions, not on velvet curtains crawling with mites. Even the smell was rationalized. Guests who noticed the musty odor of a bedroom dismissed it as the scent of home. A faint sweetness of perfume was enough to disguise it. Lavender sachets were tucked into drawers, dried herbs placed in pillowcases, vinegar bowls left in corners to purify the air. None of it worked. All of it persisted. And still, the illusion was protected. Because to admit that bedrooms, the most intimate, private spaces, were filthy, was to admit that refinement itself was a lie. It was easier to believe in velvet and lace. Easier to imagine that beauty equaled purity. Easier to sleep in vermin than to wake to reality. Clara never questioned her bed. She thought of it as sanctuary. She lit candles on her nightstand, prayed softly before sleep, and rested her head against pillows that reeked faintly of sweat, powder, and thyme. The itching on her calves was ignored. The occasional red mark on her arms dismissed. She slept soundly enough, convinced that comfort was measured not in cleanliness, but in layers of fabric between herself and the cold night air. And Eliza, rising early to straighten the sheets and fluff the pillows, carried the truth silently in her hands. She knew the bed was alive. She knew the curtains reeked. She knew the carpets coughed up filth with every step. But she also knew that silence was safer than honesty. Victorian bedrooms, then, were less sanctuaries than stage sets, designed for display, suffocating in practice. Opulence that masked decay. Comfort that bred illness. Velvet that hid vermin. Because in this world, the illusion of elegance was always worth more than the reality of health. By morning, Clara's bedroom looked pristine again. Eliza had drawn the curtains, smoothed the sheets, arranged the pillows, and brushed away the dust that gathered overnight. To a visitor, it was a room of elegance, quiet, polished, fit for a lady. To Eliza, it was a chamber of hidden labour, one she tended daily, knowing she was simply rearranging decay. Bedrooms in Victorian homes were paradoxes. They were places of intimacy, but not honesty. They looked warm but smelled faintly of mildew. They appeared inviting, yet suffocated the very lungs of those who slept in them. The more wealthy the family, the heavier the curtains, the thicker the carpets, the more upholstered the chairs, and the greater the infestation. Poorer homes, at least, had fewer fabrics to trap vermin. Ironically, austerity sometimes meant cleaner air. Clara's mattress was a decade old. It had never been fully washed, only flipped or beaten occasionally. Each layer of horsehair inside had absorbed years of sweat. Each night added more. She felt the sag in its centre, the faint lump where feathers had shifted, but she never questioned it. To replace a mattress was costly. To admit it was dirty was impolite. So she turned over and fell asleep in the same worn hollow, night after night, as mites and fleas feasted quietly at her skin. And yet Clara believed her bedroom was clean. Why? Because it was perfumed. Because lavender sachets hung from the bedposts. Because rose water had been sprinkled on the pillow. Because the curtains looked expensive and the quilts were embroidered. Cleanliness, once again, was not the absence of filth. It was the presence of decoration. The irony grew crueler with the introduction of gaslighting. Bedrooms lit by gas burners filled with fumes each evening, adding yet another invisible poison to the already heavy air. Doctors occasionally warned that sleeping with gas lamps burning could suffocate occupants, Many ignored the warnings. A softly glowing lamp was more respectable than a darkened room, even if it meant waking with a headache and coughing lungs. Servants bore the worst of this burden. Eliza's bed was a straw pallet in the attic. The roof leaked in winter, dampening the straw, leaving her shivering under thin blankets. Rats scurried at night. The air smelled of mould. And yet, in a grim twist of fortune, her bed was sometimes healthier than Clara's. Fewer layers, fewer curtains, fewer fabrics to trap stale air. The attic, draughty and crude, at least allowed circulation. Clara's velvet-wrapped chamber was far more elegant, and far more suffocating. Still, status dictated the narrative. Clara had refinement. Eliza had squalor. Never mind that refinement crawled with vermin and stank of mildew. Appearances, as always, outweighed reality. This pattern extended to the very way families treated their bedrooms. Sheets were not changed weekly. Quilts were not laundered seasonally. Mattresses were not replaced until they collapsed entirely. And when illnesses spread, no one looked to the bed as the culprit. A fever was blamed on bad air, on nerves, on divine punishment, anything but the literal nests of vermin embedded in household furniture. Letters from the period mention this reality in passing. One woman wrote of waking to find black specks on her pillow, which she dismissed as soot from the fire. Another spoke of a peculiar scent in her mattress that no airing could remove. Neither mentioned vermin directly. To speak the truth would be indecent. Silence was safer. Illusion was easier. This silence fed an entire economy of cover-ups. Bed linens embroidered with flowers distracted from stains. Perfumed sachets masked the odour of sweat. Feather beds were fluffed to disguise their lumps. Visitors praised the beauty of the arrangements without daring to inhale too deeply. Bedrooms became theatre sets, designed for admiration, never inspection. The health toll was immense. Tuberculosis thrived in stale bedrooms. Respiratory infections spread from one family member to another as they slept in close quarters, breathing the same heavy air. Dust settled in lungs. Mould crept silently through plaster. Children wasted away, their mothers wept, and still the curtains remained closed. To open a window at night was considered reckless. Better to cough in silence than to invite a draught. And through it all, Clara dreamed sweetly beneath her canopy. She whispered prayers, clutched her rosary, and turned her face against a pillow damp with sweat. She never thought of what lived inside it. She never wondered about the faint lines on her arms from unseen bites. She told herself that comfort was defined by fabric count, by the weight of the quilt, by the smoothness of the lace at the hem of her sheets. Eliza in the attic knew better. She scratched at her legs, felt the straw shift beneath her, smelled the mould. She longed for softness, even as she suspected softness meant infestation. But she never said it. Servants did not lecture mistresses about hygiene. They carried the filth in silence, the same way they carried buckets of water, trays of food, armloads of soiled laundry. Victorian bedrooms, then, were less about sleep and more about status. They projected refinement while breeding illness. They suffocated under fabric while boasting of comfort. They trapped bodies in airless chambers while pretending to protect them. They were museums of appearances, curated daily by hands like Eliza's, lived in nightly by women like Clara, and remembered falsely by the historians who painted them as havens of grace. The truth is simpler and darker. Those velvet rooms were not sanctuaries. They were cages padded with vermin, and everyone agreed to call them beautiful. Chapter 10. The Final Mask of Refinement. By the late evening, after the dinners were cleared and the conversations faded into yawns, Clara prepared herself for the final performance of the day. The rituals of morning powder, perfume, pins had long since settled into the background of her body. The gown she wore was heavy with the scent of lavender water and the faint musk of sweat that no amount of starch could truly disguise. Her hair, pinned and perfumed, itched where the scalp burned beneath its braids. Her skin, powdered pale, tingled with the sting of vinegar and lead. And yet, as she walked toward the drawing-room mirror, she smiled. This was the final mask of refinement, the illusion before sleep, the last glance that told her she was still respectable, still elegant, still worthy of admiration. It is almost absurd when you step back. How much of Victorian hygiene was nothing more than illusion? Perfume masking sweat, powder masking blemishes, curtains masking vermin, a single brush shared by many mouths masking disease. It was all performance, designed not for health but for appearances, and no place displayed this more clearly than the evening rituals of the household. Clara removed her gloves, fingers trembling slightly from the tightness of her corset. Her wrists were red, rubbed raw. She dabbed them with rose water. The sting made her wince, but she smiled anyway. She powdered them again. A lady must look unblemished, even in private. Then came the face. The layers of powder applied that morning had thickened through the day, mixing with oil, sweat, and the faintest trace of soot from gas lamps. The result was a pale mask, streaked with faint cracks. Clara dabbed at it with a cloth soaked in vinegar, believing it cleansed her pores. It burned. She accepted the burn as a sign of cleanliness, a sign of virtue, a sign that she had not failed in her duty as a woman to appear untouched by the world. But beneath the mask, the truth grew worse. Her skin was irritated, peeling from years of powders laced with arsenic. Her gums bled faintly when she smiled. Her scalp was alive with nits she pretended not to feel. And her gown. It smelled faintly of mildew no matter how much perfume she sprayed. The illusion was cracking, but only in silence. No one dared point it out. Not her husband, who believed elegance was his wife's duty. Not her guests, who preferred the illusion over the truth. Not even Eliza, who saw it all and said nothing. Because that was the heart of Victorian hygiene, not health, not care, not honesty, but silence. The silence filled every corner of the house. It surrounded menstruation, shrouding women in shame each month. It clung to the shared toothbrush, as though infection could be ignored into non-existence. It lingered in the bedrooms, where vermin crawled freely but were never mentioned. And it followed Clara now, as she dabbed her cheeks with urine water, smoothed her hair beneath a nightcap, and slipped into sheets that smelled faintly of mould and roses. It is tempting to laugh at this, to shake our heads at onions under pillows, ashes on skin, urine on cheeks, and gowns aired in coal smoke rather than washed. But to laugh is to miss the cruelty of it. These rituals weren't quirks. They were cages. They kept women trapped in cycles of pain and silence, convinced that discomfort was virtue, that suffering was refinement, that decay was beauty. Clara didn't believe she was dirty. She believed she was dignified. And that belief mattered more than her health. It was all she had. In a world where she had no vote, no property, no independence, refinement was her armour. Powder was her shield. Perfume was her sword. To lay them down would be to admit weakness. So she carried them, even as they poisoned her, even as they suffocated her. Eliza, standing by the doorway with the basin, knew better. She had no armour, no perfume, no mask. Her survival depended not on illusion but on labour. She scrubbed the soiled cloths, boiled the linens, emptied the chamber pots, and carried the weight of the household's decay in her raw hands. She saw the hypocrisy, but she could not name it. Naming it meant ruin. Silence was safer, always silence. And so the system endured. Clara, powdered and perfumed, slipped beneath her canopy. Eliza blew out the lamp. The room fell into darkness, thick with the smell of dust, sweat and roses. Outside, London groaned beneath coal smoke and sewage. Inside, the illusion of refinement remained intact, stitched together by silence and ritual. This is the final mask. The illusion of elegance that cost women their health, the silence that suffocated truth, the rituals that preserved decay while destroying the body. Victorian hygiene, in the end, was not about cleanliness. It was about control, about teaching women that suffering was noble, that silence was beauty, that their bodies were never their own. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all, because the filth could be washed away, the lice could be combed out, the vermin could be killed, but the silence outlived them all. The night was supposed to be a time of restoration. For Victorians, it was marketed as such. Early to bed, early to rise, the moralists said, as if lying down beneath quilts stuffed with feathers and sweat was somehow medicinal. Bedrooms were shrines to respectability, but respectability didn't keep the lungs clear, nor did it banish the vermin. It only added more layers of silence, tucked carefully between the sheets. Clara, as she drifted to sleep, believed herself safe. The lavender sachet sewn into her pillowcase gave a faint floral scent, convincing her the bed was fresh. The vinegar bowl in the corner supposedly purified the air, though it only added another sour note to the cocktail of sweat, mould and coal dust. She believed she was clean because the illusion told her so. Yet beneath the surface, the truth crawled, quite literally. Mattresses of the time were rarely replaced, often inherited. A bed wasn't just furniture. It was a generational relic. Families passed them down the way they passed down portraits and silverware. No one thought to question what lurked inside. Clara's mattress had belonged to her mother before her, a legacy of horsehair and dampness that was now more ecosystem than bedding. It had absorbed the sweat of decades. It had fed colonies of mites longer than Clara had been alive. And still, she slept soundly in it, believing the embroidered canopy above her was proof of refinement. Refinement. There's the word again. A word stretched so thin in Victorian society, it covered rot like paint over mould. It excused perfumes that burned skin, powders that poisoned blood, gowns that concealed mildew, and sheets that swarmed with lice. If it looked respectable, it was respectable. The truth was irrelevant. The body was irrelevant. Only the illusion mattered. And so women like Clara endured it all. They endured the itching, the rashes, the smells. They endured gowns that were never washed, hair that was never freed, teeth brushed with bloodied bristles, rooms suffocating with curtains heavy as coffins. They endured because silence demanded it, because to complain was unladylike, to name the problem was indecent. Better to itch quietly than to admit you weren't what society told you to be, perfect, pale, perfumed porcelain. It is almost cruel how effective this illusion was. Visitors to Clara's home saw nothing amiss. They admired her gowns, praised her complexion, complimented her freshness. They didn't smell the mildew hidden beneath rosewater. They didn't notice the faint scratching at her temple where lice gnawed. They didn't feel the dampness of sheets that had absorbed years of breath. They didn't see the way her corset bruised her ribs, the way her chemise stiffened with sweat, the way her rags stained red once a month. They saw refinement, and that was enough. Even the medical profession, which should have been the last refuge of honesty, bowed to the illusion. Doctors knew that corsets deformed ribs. They knew arsenic creams burned skin. They knew vermin-infested bedding. But what good was truth in a society built on silence? Many simply adjusted their theories to fit the fantasy. They claimed fainting was a sign of feminine delicacy. They praised pale skin as a marker of virtue, never mind that it came from poison. They declared heavy fabrics protective, ignoring the tuberculosis breeding in stale air. Medicine, too, played its part in maintaining the mask. Eliza saw more truth than any doctor. She washed the cloth stiff with blood. She scrubbed the linens sour with sweat. She aired gowns reeking of mildew. She combed lice from hair. She beat carpets until clouds of filth rose like smoke. She knew the illusion better than anyone because she held it in her hands each day. But she kept silent. She had to. Servants who spoke truth rarely lasted long. Better to breathe dust than to lose work. Better to swallow honesty than to be dismissed. And so the cycle continued. Generation after generation, women passed down not just dresses or jewels, but the rituals of illusion. The vinegar cloth for the face, the onion for the pillow, the perfume for the gown, the powder for the skin, the silence for everything. Daughters learned it from mothers, servants enforced it, husbands expected it, and society celebrated it. But the cost was staggering. Behind every portrait of a Victorian lady, radiant and refined, lies a body suffocating under layers of decay. Behind every candlelit ball, fragrant with perfume, lies a room thick with the stench of sweat and mould. Behind every smile lies a mouth eroded by chalk and rot. Behind every gown lies skin raw with rash, blood quietly soaking into cloth. Behind every silence lies suffering. The final mask of refinement wasn't powder or perfume or fabric. It was the silence itself, the refusal to admit what everyone knew, that the elegance was rotten, that the beauty was poisoned, that the comfort was a lie. Silence was the glue that held the illusion together, stronger than any corset lace or velvet curtain. It bound women into roles they could not escape, into bodies they could not claim, into suffering they could not name. And that silence is perhaps the most haunting legacy of all. Because the filth can be imagined, the smells can be forgotten, the insects can be dismissed as relics of another age. But the silence, its shape, its weight, its suffocating presence, remains familiar even now. The demand to look better than you feel, to smile through pain, to disguise discomfort as dignity, to call suffering refinement. Clara never broke the silence. She died years later, praised as a woman of elegance, remembered for her poise, admired for her beauty. Eliza buried her, washed the linens one last time, folded the gowns, aired the curtains. The rituals continued with Clara's daughter. The silence endured. And here, perhaps, lies the bitter truth. Victorian women smelled worse than we think, not because they wanted to, not because they were ignorant, but because society demanded it, because silence demanded it, because the mask of refinement was stronger than honesty. So the next time you imagine a Victorian ballroom heavy with silk and perfume, picture also the mildew beneath the lace, the rot beneath the powder, the vermin beneath the velvet. Picture the silence, thicker than the air, heavier than the curtains, holding it all together. And remember, in the end, it was never really about hygiene. It was about illusion. An illusion so powerful, it convinced an entire era to suffer quietly and to call their suffering beautiful. And so, dear history lovers and insomniacs, we leave the velvet-draped chambers of the Victorians behind. You've walked through their powdered rituals, their onion-scented pillows, their gowns stiff with sweat, their bedrooms alive with vermin. You've seen how an entire society chose silence over honesty, illusion over health, and how women carried the weight of that silence in their skin, their hair, their very breath. It is easy to laugh at the onion under the pillow or the urine on the cheeks, but remember, these were not jokes to the women who lived them. They were obligations. They were chains hidden in perfume bottles and powder tins. They remind us that history is rarely as elegant as the portraits suggest. Behind every satin gown was mildew. Behind every powdered smile was pain. So as you drift off tonight, know that refinement has always had a price, and that sometimes the greatest stink in history is not the sweat or the filth, but the silence that tried to cover it all. Thank you for joining me, as always, on this late-night journey. This has been the Drowsy Historian. Until next time, sleep well, dream dark, and never trust the perfume too much. Good night.